Hello there, and welcome to Planet in Question, the little corner where curiosity doesn't hurry and science takes its time. Tonight, I'd like to invite you into a thought that may feel both strange and strangely soothing. It's about a world not too far from our own, a world that very nearly was, but one that slipped away because of a changing climate. The idea is simple, and yet when you sit with it for a while, it begins to open like a frozen flower. What if Earth never left the Ice Age? What if the immense glaciers that once covered whole continents never truly melted away, never gave ground to forests and grasslands and seas, but instead continued their long, cold reign? Before we begin, I'd like you to pause with me for a moment. Where are you listening from right now? Are you tucked into bed, perhaps with a blanket pulled close around you? Maybe you're in a quiet room with just the hum of the evening around you, or maybe it's daytime where you are, and you're simply looking for a calm place to rest your thoughts for a little while. However you've arrived here, you and I are meeting in this moment, connected not by warmth or cold, but by the quiet act of wandering. That feels fitting, doesn't it? Because this is a story about a planet, and planets always exist in shared silence, carrying every creature, every breath, every sound together. Now, the world we know today is shaped by warmth. Our civilizations grew in climates where rivers could flow freely, where fields could be planted, where seasons turned in a rhythm steady enough for people to rely on. But this balance is recent. Just a blink ago, in the geological sense, the Earth was colder, harsher, wrapped in sheets of ice so massive that they swallowed mountains. And when those glaciers finally pulled back, they left behind the world we recognize. The soil we farm, the rivers we follow, the coasts we settle. If they had not retreated, if they had stayed, our story would be altogether different. Try to imagine it. Not the Earth you see outside your window, but an Earth held tight in a long winter. Imagine whole valleys drowned in ice, plains scraped down to bare stone, seas drawn away into frozen prisons, leaving behind vast flat lands where water once shimmered. The air itself would feel heavier, sharper, a constant breath of frost. The landscapes we take for granted today, green forests, rolling hills, fertile farmland, would never truly exist. Instead, we would know tundra, windswept steppe, endless glaciers glittering in pale sunlight. This thought alone begins to shift our perspective. You might picture mammoths roaming in herds across icy plains, their shaggy coats catching the light of low suns. Saber-toothed cats crouching at the edges of frozen forests, silent hunters in a world where survival is always precarious. Giant sloths, dire wolves, cave bears, creatures that once were real, but that vanished. As the ice withdrew, might still be with us, filling the earth with their presence, shaping our myths and fears and hopes in ways we can only guess at now. And then there are people. Our ancestors lived through that cold world. They hunted, they crafted tools from bone and stone, they gathered around fires that glowed against the endless night. For them, the Ice Age wasn't an alternate history. It was the only history they knew. If the glaciers had stayed, if the warming had never come, then our path as humans would have unfolded entirely differently. No fields of wheat rippling in summer wind, no orchards heavy with fruit, perhaps no cities rising at all, because the earth would not have made room for them. We would have been travellers still, moving with the herds, following the shifting edges of the ice. It's easy to forget how delicate this balance is. The retreat of the Ice Age was not guaranteed. It depended on subtle changes in the tilt of the earth, in the pull of the sun, in the blanket of gases in the sky. If any of those had tipped a little differently, if warmth had never gained its fragile foothold, then tonight we would be living on a very different planet. A colder planet, a planet still locked in the embrace of ancient ice. Now, I don't want you to feel rushed as you picture this. Let it unfold slowly, the way frost spreads across a window pane. Think of the sound of snow underfoot, crisp and hollow. Think of the deep quiet that settles over a frozen lake, where even your breath feels like a disturbance. That's the tone of the world we're imagining tonight. Not a loud catastrophe, not an apocalyptic vision, but a calm and enduring stillness, a planet that never quite woke from its winter. And as we wander through this speculation, there's something comforting about it too. Earth is full of paths not taken, full of possible worlds that almost were. By imagining them, we remind ourselves that our own reality is not inevitable, it is precious. The warmth we live in, the soil we plant, the seasons we rely upon, these are all gifts of a particular climate, one that could easily have gone another way. So, tonight, we'll walk slowly through this alternate Earth. We'll look at its landscapes, its skies, its animals. We'll think about the people who might have lived there, the cultures they might have built, the stories they might have told. And we'll wonder, gently, what it means for us, here and now, to live on the version of Earth that thawed. If you find comfort in this kind of slow journey, in speculation that doesn't demand belief but simply offers a place to rest your imagination, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a like, or perhaps subscribed. It helps this little patch of quiet reach others who might need it. And now that we're settled, let's begin our walk into a frozen Earth. Not hurried, not loud, but step by step, as though crunching across snow that has lain untouched for centuries. Picture yourself standing on the edge of a vast plain, the air so sharp and crisp that every breath seems to hang in front of you like a small ghost before drifting away. Beneath your feet, the ground is frozen solid, and ahead of you stretches a horizon dominated not by mountains or forests, but by a wall of ice. This is not a glacier in the way we know them now, tucked away in remote ranges or polar corners. This is ice that commands continents, ice that towers over valleys, ice that has held the world in its grip for tens of thousands of years. This is the stage on which Earth's story might still be unfolding if the Ice Age had never released its hold. Take a moment to imagine what that means. Entire regions we now think of as farmland, as bustling cities, or as quiet countryside would be unrecognizable. Much of northern Europe, the northern half of North America, and great stretches of Asia would be buried under mile-thick glaciers. Rivers as we know them would be rerouted, cut off, or trapped beneath frozen caps. Seas would be lower, exposing lands that now lie hidden beneath the waves. Places like the Bering Strait, today a narrow channel of water between Russia and Alaska, would not be a sea at all but a wide expanse of dry land, a permanent bridge where animals and people could wander freely. Coastlines would look unfamiliar, with beaches pulled far away from where they rest today, leaving behind vast empty plains. The light itself would feel different. Winters would be long, summers short and cool, the sun rarely climbing high in the sky except near the equator. Even at noon, the shadows would stretch long across the ground. The colours of the world would be muted white, grey, pale blue, the dark green of hardy pines that clung to the edges of the ice. Where we know wide forests and fertile valleys, there would be tundra and steppe, endless windswept grasses bending beneath the cold. It would be a quieter landscape, stripped of much of the lushness we associate with life today. But quieter does not mean empty. Life has a way of finding its place even in the most difficult conditions. Herds of mammoths would graze across the plains, their long hair swaying, tusks curving like ivory arcs against the horizon. Woolly rhinoceroses would lumber in their shadow, while reindeer herds traced long seasonal migrations that might span hundreds of miles. Predators too would thrive saber-toothed cats, with their elongated fangs flashing in the dim light, or packs of dire wolves, larger and stronger than the wolves we know now, moving together across the frozen earth. For them, this would not be a wasteland. This would be home, a stable and familiar rhythm of cold and hunger, of survival and adaptation. Now, consider the humans of this world. Our ancestors did not look at the ice as a barrier, but as a fact of existence. They had no memory of forests stretching across continents, or of warm valleys filled with crops. Their lives revolved around fire, around clothing made of skins, around the constant movement needed to follow food. Imagine waking each day to the smell of smoke lingering from a fire that never truly dies, to the sound of wind rushing against the edges of a tent made of hides and bones. Imagine carrying tools of stone, knowing the weight of them in your hand, the way we now know the weight of a phone or a book. If the Ice Age had never ended, this would still be the human story. Not fields planted in neat rows, not villages beside rivers, not cities spreading into skylines, but people forever on the move, carrying their homes on their backs, leaving behind only footprints and ashes. Civilization as we know it might never have emerged. Instead, culture would be oral, passed down by voices around the fire. Knowledge would be measured not in written scrolls but in memory, in stories told again and again so they would not fade. This frozen world would also shape belief. To live beneath a sky that so often withheld warmth would make the sun a deity, unlike any other, a distant and precious presence to be revered. The moon, casting pale light over snowfields, would have its own power, guiding night journeys and shaping myths of cycles and return. Storms rolling across the tundra would be feared as spirits in their own right, forces not to be challenged but endured. A world of cold is a world of awe, where survival itself feels like a gift from powers beyond comprehension. But let's pause again and notice the details. Picture the sound of ice cracking far in the distance, echoing like thunder across the plains. Picture the faint glitter of frost catching sunlight, turning the ground into a field of diamonds. Picture the silence between moments, so deep that you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. This is not a world rushing forward. This is a world holding still, a world where time feels suspended, each day echoing the one before. And yet, change would still happen. Slowly, subtly. Glaciers move, even if so slowly we cannot see them. Over centuries, valleys would be carved deeper, rocks ground to dust, rivers forced to shift their paths. For creatures living there, it would feel eternal. But in the long view, even ice is not truly still. The world beneath it would be transformed in ways too gradual for human eyes, but profound in the story of the Earth. If we allow ourselves to sink into this thought, it becomes clear that such a frozen planet would not just look different, it would feel different. The rhythm of life would be slower, more deliberate, more cautious. There would be no rushing toward progress, no sense of abundance waiting to be tapped. Everything would be about balance, about taking only what could be found, about moving carefully with the seasons. Human culture, animal survival, even the shape of the land, would all be woven into this one condition: the reign of the ice. And so, when we ask what if Earth never left the Ice Age, we are not only asking about geography or climate, we are asking about a completely different way of being, a world where survival defines everything, where the cold writes the rules. To live there would be to live in intimacy with limits, with hardship, but also with beauty of a quieter, harsher kind. And as we step forward into the next part of this journey, we'll begin to explore what it means for the entire planet to be caught in that long winter, a winter that might have lasted not just thousands but millions of years. 2. A world of ice. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the Earth not as it is now, but as it might have remained had the Ice Age never loosened its grip. Imagine gazing upon a globe where the familiar green and blue have been replaced by sweeping expanses of white, where ice sheets stretch down from the poles like vast frozen blankets, swallowing continents whole. North America, nearly 2/3 buried beneath a sheet that could reach miles thick. Northern Europe and Asia hidden under the same weight, a crushing stillness that holds the land in silence. Even mountain ranges, the tallest peaks we know, would be crowned with deeper snow and endless ice, their rugged lines softened into rounded mounds under the pressure of centuries of frost. The air itself would feel different. Step outside in such a world and you would notice how light carries differently over snow, sharp and reflective, dazzling the eyes even when the sun sits low in the sky. In winter, daylight would shrink to just a few short hours, dim and cold, while nights stretched on like unbroken tapestries of stars. Summer would bring little relief. The glaciers would not vanish with the season. Instead, they would sigh and crack along their edges, shedding icebergs into the seas but never surrendering their rule. Even in the warmest months, the ground would remain hard beneath your feet, frozen beyond the reach of roots or rivers. Think of the wind sweeping across these surfaces. With no forest to break them, no cities to catch their breath, they would rush across the plains with a voice like a constant whisper, or sometimes a roar. Snow, fine and powdery, would drift endlessly, reshaping the land in patterns that shifted from day to day. To live in such a world would be to live with that sound always in the background, the sigh of wind, the groan of ice, the quiet hush of falling snowflakes that never seem to stop. And beneath those glaciers, an entire geography would sleep. Valleys carved by ice would lie hidden from the sky. Rivers that once flowed freely would be trapped beneath frozen ceilings, rerouted or swallowed altogether. Mountains would grind against the moving sheets, their jagged faces worn down to slopes of powdered stone. In a sense, this earth would not be static. It would be moving, shifting, sculpting itself under the slow crawl of ice, though to human eyes it might appear eternal. Imagine, too, the seas. With so much water locked away in frozen form, the oceans would have shrunk, drawing back their edges to reveal lands we no longer know. Vast plains would stretch where the English Channel now lies, where the Mediterranean meets its coasts, where islands dot the Pacific. The familiar outlines of continents would be different, their edges extended into strange new shapes. Perhaps people would walk from one landmass to another without needing ships, their paths guided not by waves but by winds across dry seabeds. In this frozen earth, the map itself would be rewritten, coastlines redrawn in silence, and still, life would find its place. The ice would not cover everything, only most of it. There would be fringes, long belts of tundra where mosses, lichens, and hardy grasses could take root. In these grey-green zones, herds would roam in their thousands, mammoths, with their thick coats and sweeping tusks, moving like shadows against the snow. Caribou and reindeer threading their way across endless plains, their hooves clicking against frozen ground. Musk, oxen, bison, and wild horses adding their presence to the great migrations. Even in this cold, the earth would thrum with life, a life tuned to hardship, to scarcity, to movement, and where prey gathers, predators follow. The world of ice would belong also to the saber-toothed cat, muscles rippling under its fur as it watched the plains, to the dire wolf, moving in packs that could take down creatures many times its size, to the cave lion and the short-faced bear, rulers of their domains, adapted to a world where strength and endurance were the only currency. In such a world, the balance of predator and prey would be stark, survival, a daily negotiation between hunger and escape. Now, think of how it would feel to be human here. No villages, no permanent fields, no orchards, heavy with fruit. Instead, survival would mean following the rhythm of the herds, learning the habits of the seasons, moving constantly. Fires would burn through long nights, the crackling flames not just a source of warmth but of hope, a fragile barrier against the immensity of cold pressing in from every side. Shelter would be skins stretched across frames, bones lashed together to form the skeletons of homes portable enough to carry. Tools would be sharpened stone, chipped and shaped with care, each one precious, each one the difference between hunger and a meal. The world of ice would also shape memory and story. Picture sitting by a fire in a frozen cave, shadows dancing against the stone as someone paints a mammoth on the wall. It is not art for beauty alone, but memory, teaching, prayer. It is a way to make sense of the endless white beyond the cave's entrance, to honour the animals that give life, to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. In such a world, imagination and survival would be bound together, both serving the same purpose, to keep the tribe alive, to give shape to existence. But let's take another step outward. Beyond the survival of one group or one herd lies the atmosphere of the planet itself. In a permanent ice age, Earth's climate would not just be colder, it would be dramatically different in its rhythms. Great storms would rage along the edges of the glaciers, fueled by contrasts between frozen land and open sea. Winds would carry dry snow across continents, burying anything that stood in their path. Rainforests would shrink, deserts might expand, and many of the species we know today would never emerge at all. The sheer presence of ice would dictate everything, even in lands it did not directly cover. And yet, within this frozen story lies a kind of beauty. The auroras would shine brighter, shimmering curtains of green and purple lighting the endless night skies. The silence of snowfields would be profound, broken only by the calls of animals or the whispers of wind. The stars would blaze against a backdrop of clean, crisp air, every constellation more vivid than we can imagine now. For those living in it, this world would be harsh, yes, but also magnificent, a constant reminder of forces larger than themselves. As we linger in this thought, it's worth noticing how such a world would shape not only survival, but perspective. Life in a frozen earth would be slower, more deliberate. Every step would matter, every fire would matter, every story told beside the flames would matter. The glaciers themselves would be monuments beyond comprehension, older than generations, moving so slowly that they seemed eternal. To live in their shadow would be to live with humility, knowing that the world was not made for you but that you were made to endure within it. This, then, is the world of ice. A planet wrapped in silence and frost, reshaping itself in ways too vast for human eyes, yet alive with creatures who belong to it completely. A planet where human beings, small and vulnerable, would still find their place, still tell their stories, still light their fires against the dark. If Earth had never left this state, This is the stage upon which all of history would have unfolded. A colder, quieter, and perhaps in some ways more eternal story than the one we know. 3. Oceans withdrawn. Imagine standing on the edge of what you know today as a coastline. Perhaps it is a familiar one, the cliffs of Western Europe, the sandy beaches of North America, or the rocky shores of Asia. But in a world where the Ice Age never ended, you would not find waves lapping at your feet. Instead, you would be staring out across a vast, empty plain, a landscape where the sea has pulled back hundreds of miles. The horizon is not the glimmer of blue water, but a haze of land stretching outward, exposed for the first time in tens of millions of years. The oceans, locked away in frozen walls at the poles, have withdrawn, and in their absence they have revealed an Earth that feels both strange and eerily familiar. To understand this, you have to remember how much of Earth's water the glaciers hold. In the world we know, the retreat of ice released seas into their present levels, swallowing coastlines and drawing maps we now take for granted. But if the ice had remained, the seas would be smaller, shallower, and set back, leaving behind new continents, new bridges, new paths. Imagine walking across dry land where the English Channel should be, travelling from France to Britain without ever seeing a boat. Picture the Bering Strait not as a thin sliver of water, but as a wide corridor of tundra connecting Asia to the Americas, open forever, not just for a fleeting moment in history. These exposed lands would not be deserts, though some might be barren. They would be windswept plains, carved by rivers that once flowed into oceans, their beds stretching onward into valleys that no longer meet the sea. The ground might be soft with silt, the remnants of ancient sediments left behind when the waters pulled away. Fossil shells and coral reefs would sit far inland, reminders that this ground once belonged to another world, a wetter one. Imagine finding a whale skeleton half buried in soil hundreds of miles from the present-day shore, its bones a monument to the oceans that retreated and never returned. Humanity in such a world would have known these places not as mysteries but as home. Migration paths would have been unbroken, a constant ribbon of land between continents. The Pacific Islands would not be scattered jewels but broad plateaus of earth, some large enough to hold whole peoples, others stretching into new continents altogether. Australia might not have been isolated, but connected by sweeping corridors of plains. The Americas would not have been reached by dangerous sea crossings, but by steady walking, following herds across the endless steppe. Civilization, if it had risen at all, would not have thought of oceans as barriers. They would be distant, unreachable things, their margins lying far away beyond the horizon. The world would feel more whole, its land masses more tightly joined, a single stage instead of scattered islands of life. Now, think of how the oceans themselves would appear, smaller, colder, fringed with icebergs drifting far from the poles. The great currents that warm our present climate would be stifled, their pathways blocked or weakened by frozen barriers. Tropical seas might still exist, but they would be narrower, pushed toward the equator, hemmed in by the loss of water to the glaciers. Coral reefs, if they survived at all, would cling to these shrinking margins, struggling against waters too cold, too shallow, too unstable. The rich biodiversity we know today, colourful fish darting among corals, vast schools of life swirling in warm currents might never have flourished. Instead, the seas would belong to hardier creatures, species adapted to chill waters and thin resources. And yet, these oceans would be full in their own way. Imagine vast shoals of fish drawn to the cold, plankton-rich waters stirred by icy winds. Imagine whales tracing routes along endless fronts, where glaciers carved into the sea, their songs echoing through waters less crowded with ships, less disturbed by human presence. The ocean's surface would be quieter, its depths less explored, but its life would be no less abundant, only different, adapted to cold instead of warmth, to scarcity instead of plenty. The withdrawal of oceans would also reshape climate. The exposed seabeds would reflect more sunlight, adding to the chill. Dust storms might sweep across dry plains where waves once washed, carrying nutrients but also desolation across continents. Rainfall would shift, drawn away from places where seas no longer fed the sky. Some regions might be locked in drought, while others drowned in storms rolling in from newly exposed coasts. This world of smaller seas would be less forgiving, less balanced, a place where every change carried deep consequences for the creatures living there. Now, picture what it would feel like to stand on these empty plains. The silence would be enormous, the space vast and echoing. You might see herds of animals crossing where once there was only water, mammoths raising trunks against the wind, wild horses galloping across the flats, humans walking steadily behind them. These plains would feel otherworldly, a kind of borrowed land, as though the sea might come back at any moment, though in truth it never would. And in a way, they would be both gift and trap. A gift because they connected the continents, but a trap because they left no room for retreat. When storms rolled in across these endless flats, there would be no harbour to run to, no coast to hide upon, only the open expanse of wind and dust. For humans, this world without oceans at their edges would shape imagination. Perhaps they would not see the sea as a great unknown, but as a distant, icy desert beyond reach. Stories would not be of sailing, but of walking. Gods would not rule the waves, but the wind and the plains. The myths of a people who never sailed would be stories of journeys across endless land, of horizons that never ended, of rivers that flowed but never touched the sea. The idea of separation, the thought that continents could be apart, might never have entered their minds. And yet, the sea itself would still hold mystery. Even reduced, even withdrawn, it would remain vast. To reach its edge would still be to face something immense and untamed. The sound of waves would be rarer, the smell of salt less familiar, but both would be powerful when encountered. For people who lived mostly inland, the sea would not be an everyday presence but a distant wonder, a place of pilgrimage. To see it might feel like seeing the edge of the world, a boundary between the known and the unknowable. In imagining these oceans withdrawn, we see how deeply water shapes our reality. Without it, the world grows larger, emptier, and perhaps lonelier. The great journeys of human history, crossing seas, charting islands, exploring distant coasts, would never exist. Instead, journeys would be endless walks, migrations without end, paths across plains that stretched where the sea once lay. And the creatures of the deep, the dolphins, the colourful fish, the coral gardens, might never have been known, their beauty hidden beneath waters too cold, too remote, too diminished to thrive. So, in this frozen earth, the oceans would not vanish, but they would retreat, becoming shadows of what they are today. They would leave behind lands that humans and animals would fill, lands that once belonged to the sea but that now belong to the air and the wind. It would be a quieter ocean, a smaller ocean, a sea that stayed at a distance instead of pressing against every shore. And with that silence, that absence, the world itself would be rewritten, its coasts stretched outward, its horizons shifted, its imagination changed forever. 4. The skies of an icy world. Look up for a moment and picture the sky. Not the one you know today, but the one that would arch over a planet that never left the ice age. The air would carry a different kind of weight, thinner in warmth yet thick with cold, moving in patterns unfamiliar to us. Clouds would build not in gentle layers but in heavy, brooding masses, rolling endlessly across frozen plains and glacial shelves. The sky of such a world would not be a calm backdrop but a restless presence, shaping life as profoundly as the ice itself. In this frozen earth, sunlight would always feel fragile. Even in summer, the sun would struggle to climb high, lingering close to the horizon in northern latitudes. Its light would cast long, pale shadows, the glow more silver than gold. Instead of bright afternoons, days would feel like extended mornings and evenings, caught in a perpetual twilight. The warmth we associate with sunshine, the way it settles on skin, the way it ripens fruit or draws flowers upward would rarely be felt. The light would be there, yes, but muted, refracted through a sky heavy with ice crystals. The world beneath it would glimmer with cold brilliance, sparkling but never thawing. Night would be longer, darker, but also more alive with stars. With less moisture rising from oceans, the air would be dry and clear, a perfect canvas for the constellations. The Milky Way would blaze across the heavens like a river of light, unbroken and dazzling. For people living in this eternal winter, the stars would not be distant curiosities but constant companions, guiding migrations, shaping myths, and giving comfort in the long hours of darkness. To look upward would be to see a universe that felt closer, sharper, more immediate than the one we know today. And then there would be the auroras, with Earth's magnetic field bending streams of charged particles toward the poles, The skies of the Ice Age would be painted often with veils of green, red, and violet. Imagine standing on a frozen steppe, the snow crunching beneath your feet, while above you the heavens ripple and shimmer as if alive. Curtains of light would rise and fall, shifting like the breath of the planet itself. For ancient humans, for whom fire was already sacred, these sky fires would be beyond comprehension, proof of powers larger than anything on Earth. Entire traditions, entire stories, might have grown around the dance of these lights, worshipping them as spirits or ancestors, treating them as messages written in the sky. But skies are not only beauty, they are weather, and in a frozen world, weather is both ally and adversary. Storms would march across the continents with a scale and force we can only imagine. Winds, unhindered by forests or tall grasses, would sweep across exposed plains with biting speed, carrying snow like sand in a desert. Blizzards would not be rare but routine, turning days into whiteouts where horizon and sky blurred together into nothingness. Thunderstorms, too, might crackle even in the cold, lightning splitting across snowy fields in dazzling but terrifying displays. To live under such skies would be to live in constant awareness of their moods, reading their signs with the same attention we now give to calendars or clocks. Rain would be scarce, replaced by snow that fell not lightly but heavily, blanketing the ground in endless layers. Each flake would join an archive thousands of years deep, compressing into the glaciers that defined the planet. The very air would carry snow often, not always in the blizzards of imagination, but in soft, persistent drifts, a steady reminder that the sky was always giving more to the ice below. Water as liquid would be precious, found only in rare melt or flowing rivers that escaped the freeze. For humans, this scarcity would shape daily life, dictating where they could rest, where they could drink, where they could survive. Seasons would still exist, but their rhythm would be muted. Summer would not bring warmth so much as a pause, a slight easing of the cold. Skies might open with clearer light, revealing the sun more fully, but never enough to melt the great glaciers. Winter, in turn, would be longer and deeper than we can imagine now, stretching across months where the sun barely showed its face at all. In some places, entire weeks would pass without daylight, the sky a ceaseless night punctuated only by stars and auroras. For people living there, the very idea of time would be measured differently, not by crops or harvests, but by the waxing and waning of light itself. Now imagine how such skies would feel to those who lived beneath them. The world would not be something to master, but something to endure, and the sky would be a teacher of patience. Children might grow up recognizing the tone of the wind as easily as we recognize a voice. Hunters might read the shapes of clouds to predict the coming of storms, their survival depending on noticing the smallest details. Storytellers would fill the long nights with tales of gods who controlled the winds, of spirits who painted the auroras, of stars that guided their ancestors across endless plains. The sky would not be background, it would be a presence, alive and intimate. And with that intimacy would come awe. Picture sitting beside a fire in a world of snow, while above you, meteors streak across the heavens, dozens in a single hour, each one a sudden flame in the cold. Picture the quiet after a blizzard, when the air grows still and the stars return, brighter than ever, shining against the silence of newly fallen snow. Picture the moon, vast and full, casting shadows so sharp across the ice that the world seems carved from silver. For those who lived in this frozen earth, such sights would not be occasional wonders, but daily companions, shaping their sense of existence. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, the skies we know would be unrecognizable. No blue expanse softened by warm haze, no rolling thunderclouds fed by steaming oceans, no easy rhythm of rain and Sunday. Instead, there would be skies of crystal clarity and sudden violence, skies painted with auroras and streaked with storms, skies that demanded reverence and attention. To live beneath them would be to live in constant dialogue with the heavens, listening to their moods, learning their lessons, and carrying their beauty into every story told. In this way, the skies of an icy earth would be both harsh and holy, filled with dangers but also with wonders. They would remind every living creature that survival was not only a matter of food or shelter, but of watching, listening, and respecting the vastness above. And as we move deeper into this thought experiment, imagining what else such a frozen earth would hold, it is worth remembering that the skies are never separate from the land below. They are reflections of one another, mirrors of the same planet, shaping life in ways that are as subtle as they are profound. 5. Animal kingdom, frozen in time. Now let us turn our gaze from the land and sky toward the creatures that would have roamed this frozen earth had the Ice Age never ended. The world of endless snow and tundra would not have been empty. It would have been alive, humming with the footsteps, wing beats, and heartbeats of animals perfectly tuned to the cold. These beings would not have seen the ice as an enemy, nor the cold as a curse. For them, it would have been the normal rhythm of life, the environment that shaped their bodies, their instincts, their stories written not in books but in bone and fur. Imagine the mammoth first. Towering, woolly, magnificent, these animals were not fantasy but fact, roaming in herds across plains that seemed to have no end. Their coats were thick and dark, layered with insulating fat beneath, their sweeping tusks curving outward like ivory crescents carved by time itself. A mammoth could use those tusks to shovel snow aside, uncovering buried grasses and herbs that lay hidden beneath winter's weight. Picture them moving slowly across the tundra, their breath steaming in the frosty air, calves huddled close to their mothers for warmth. The ground would have trembled with their weight, the air carrying their low rumbles, deep sounds that may have been ways of speaking to one another across distances where sight failed. In a world of ice, the mammoth would have been not a relic, but a neighbour. And not far from the mammoth walked the woolly rhinoceros, heavier and lower, built for power. Its body was cloaked in thick hair, its horn curved like a weapon drawn against predators bold enough to challenge it. Imagine the sound of its heavy steps crunching through the snow, its breath short and visible in the cold. It grazed across frozen plains, searching for patches of moss and grass, thriving where lesser creatures would falter. In our present world, it is gone, a fossilized memory. But in the earth of never-ending ice age, it would still be here, shaping the land, carving its presence into every ecosystem. Now picture the predators. The saber-toothed cat, its body sleek but muscular, its teeth like twin blades curving from its mouth. To us, it seems almost mythical, too strange to be real. But it was real, stalking the herds across plains and forests, waiting for the weak, the sick, the distracted. Its bite was not for chewing but for striking, a weapon meant to bring down giants. If the Ice Age had remained, the saber-toothed cat might still pace across the tundra, its golden eyes gleaming, its presence feared and respected in equal measure. And along with it, the direwolf larger than wolves we know now, its body built for endurance, its pack strategies finely honed. Imagine a dozen of them moving together, their howls carrying across the frozen air, their paws steady as they trailed herds of reindeer or musk oxen. In such a world, to hear a wolf would not be to think of fairy tales, but of survival. The giant ground sloth, too, would still lumber across parts of the world, slow but massive, pulling down branches with claws that could carve into bark. It lived at a pace that seemed unhurried, a reminder that in a frozen world, speed was not always the answer. Patience, size, and the ability to endure mattered more. Around it, flocks of giant birds might still roam terrors of the sky and ground, their wingspans wider than a man was tall, their beaks sharp as blades. Their calls would echo across empty plains, sounds that might have filled human dreams with awe and unease. Even the smaller creatures would be different. Rodents would tunnel beneath snow, creating labyrinths hidden from predators. Hares would shift their coats to pure white, vanishing into the drifts, as if becoming part of the land itself. Reindeer and caribou, with their great antlers, would move in endless migration, their hooves clicking against frozen soil, their numbers darkening the horizon as they passed. The tundra would not feel barren with them. It would feel alive, thrumming with their collective movement, a heartbeat of the frozen earth. And yet, in this alternate history, there would also be absence. Animals that we know today, zebras, elephants, lions of the savannah, brightly feathered parrots might never have evolved or thrived. The forests and jungles that shaped them would not exist, their niches erased by endless cold. Biodiversity would be narrower, harsher, focused on endurance instead of exuberance. Life would be robust but limited, strong but specialized. Earth's palette of creatures would lean toward whites, greys and browns, colors of concealment and cold, rather than the bright greens and blues of the tropics. Humans too would walk among them, but not as farmers or herders, We would be hunters, trackers, gatherers, our lives woven into the migration of herds, our survival dependent on following the great beasts of the ice. The mammoth would be not only prey but teacher, showing us how to survive in cold, teaching us patience and persistence. The dire wolf would be both rival and, perhaps in time, ally, its wild cousins eventually becoming the dogs that lay by our fires. In such a world, humans would remain closer to animals, their lives bound together not by distance but by daily dependence. Think for a moment about what that would mean for human imagination. The stories we tell now are filled with lions, foxes, ravens, snakes, creatures of forests, deserts, and warm fields. But in a frozen earth, our myths would be filled instead with mammoths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and giant sloths. The gods we painted in our minds might carry tusks, horns, or fangs. The monsters in our stories might be saber-toothed hunters that stalked the night. The animals we revered would be those who gave us food, shelter, and tools, the creatures of the cold, honoured, and feared. The animal kingdom of the frozen world would be not just a backdrop, but a presence that shaped everything. To hear the thunder of mammoth herds would be to know abundance. To see the shadow of a saber-toothed cat would be to know danger. To follow the migration of reindeer would be to know the rhythm of survival. These animals would have been our companions, our rivals, our sustenance, and our symbols, carved into bone and painted on cave walls, reminders that we were never alone in the world, even in the silence of ice, and in their presence, the earth itself would feel alive. A frozen land is not a dead one. It is simply a stage for different players, creatures adapted not to warmth but to cold, to scarcity instead of plenty. If the Ice Age had never ended, they would still be here, and we would still be living among them, our lives forever entwined with theirs. 6. Human survival. In this frozen world, where glaciers rule the continents and cold is the steady heartbeat of existence, we must turn our thoughts to the small, fragile figures of human beings. Survival here is not guaranteed. It is a daily task, a ritual repeated each morning and evening, shaped by the rhythms of a land that never truly softens. If the Ice Age had never ended, humanity would have remained bound to that challenge, its story one of endurance rather than expansion, of resilience rather than progress. Imagine waking each day in a shelter built from bones and hides, the walls thick with fur and stitched sinew, the roof weighted with snow to insulate against the biting winds. The hearth is not a luxury but the heart of existence, a glowing circle of warmth that turns the icy dark into something bearable. Fire in such a world is more than tool or comfort. It is survival itself, a flickering companion that must be fed and guarded as carefully as a child. Without it, the night becomes unlivable. Families huddle close around the flames, their bodies pressed together, the smoke curling upward through a small opening that lets the stars peek in. Food is never certain. Hunting defines every waking moment. Mammoths, reindeer, bison, and woolly rhinoceroses are the prizes, but to face them is to face danger. Spears tipped with stone are held tightly, their points sharpened by countless hours of labour. Every hunt is a test of patience and cooperation. Hunters must track for days, reading faint signs in the snow, listening for distant herds carried on the wind. When the moment comes, they strike together, driving their prey into traps, toward cliffs, or into carefully planned ambushes. The success of a hunt is not triumph alone, it is the survival of the entire group, a victory that echoes in every shared meal and in the warmth of fat and hides that keep out the cold. But hunting is not the only way. Gathering continues, though the landscape offers little. Hardy roots, edible mosses, berries that cling to life in the short summers all are collected and cherished. Women and children carry woven bags made from sinew and plant fibres, filling them with whatever the land will allow. Nothing is wasted. Bones become tools, sinew becomes thread, fat becomes fuel for lamps. In this frozen earth, thrift is not an ethic but a necessity, and creativity is the difference between survival and death. Migration defines human life. The great herds move, and people must move with them. Camps are temporary, carried on backs, broken down and rebuilt countless times. Paths are followed season after season, not written on paper but remembered in stories, in songs, in the wisdom of elders who guide their groups with memory as their only map. Imagine children listening by the fire as their grandparents describe the landmarks of the land, the bent tree where rivers meet, the ridge where mammoths once fell, the cave that holds shelter from the storm. Memory itself becomes infrastructure, the only way to ensure continuity in a world where permanence does not exist. Cold changes the body too. Clothing is thick, layered, stitched carefully from skins and furs. Mittens, boots, hoods, each one a shield against frostbite, each one an invention born from necessity. Ornament exists, but even decoration carries function. Beads and bones reinforcing seams, feathers signaling clan or lineage. The human form adapts not by evolving new traits, but by wrapping itself in the gifts of other creatures, borrowing fur, hide, and bone to extend its resilience. In a sense, survival is not solitary. It is a partnership between humans and the animals they hunt, between fire and stone, between memory and imagination. Spirituality, too, would be shaped by survival. In this never-ending ice age, every creature killed for food would be honoured, its spirit thanked in ritual. Fire would be worshipped as a living being, the keeper of warmth and life. The sun, weak but steady, would be a god whose return each day was a miracle. The auroras might be ancestors dancing, or spirits warning of storms to come. Death would be close, but so too would reverence, a recognition that survival is never owed, only borrowed from forces larger than oneself. Think also of the way humans would interact with one another. Communities would be small, tightly bound by necessity. Conflict might exist, but cooperation would be far more important. A feud could mean starvation, while generosity could mean survival. Bonds would stretch across families and clans, creating networks of trust carried not in contracts but in shared meals, in exchanged tools, in stories told across campfires. To survive the ice is to survive together, and so the human heart would be shaped not only by endurance, but by connection. Children would grow up learning not in schools but in the open, watching their parents stitch hides, shape tools, or follow tracks across the snow. They would learn to strike flint for sparks, to set traps, to read the stars. Play would mimic survival, tiny spears thrown at snow figures, small fires built from twigs. Knowledge would not be written but embodied, carried in hands and gestures, passed from one generation to the next as naturally as breathing. And what of art? Even in this world of scarcity, art would flourish. Cave walls would hold paintings of mammoths and reindeer, outlines of hands pressed in pigment, patterns that might be maps or prayers. Carved figures of ivory or bone would be carried in pockets, charms for luck, symbols of belonging. Music would echo in the caves, bone flutes whispering melodies into the darkness, drums beating rhythms that matched the heartbeat of the tribe. Even in survival, there would be beauty. Even in hardship, humans would create. Perhaps that is the truest marker of survival, not just enduring, but finding ways to make endurance meaningful. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, this would still be our life. We would be wanderers, firekeepers, storytellers beneath frozen skies. Our tools would be of stone, our homes of hide, our stories painted in ochre on cave walls. The modern world of cities, farms, machines, and electricity would never have arrived. Instead, humanity would still live by patience and persistence, bound to the movements of herds and the moods of the sky. Survival in such a world would not mean conquering the earth. It would mean listening to it, watching it, following its rhythms. It would mean humility, the recognition that humans are small but resilient, fragile but resourceful. And in that humility, perhaps, there would be a different kind of wisdom, one not measured by progress, but by balance, by endurance, by the simple yet profound act of being alive in a world of endless winter. 7. Migration paths. In a frozen Earth that never emerged from the grip of the Ice Age, humanity's story would not be one of permanent homes or cities, but of movement. Migration would not be a choice or an occasional necessity. It would be the very pattern of existence, the pulse by which life itself was measured. People would be wanderers by birth and by inheritance, moving as naturally as herds moved, as rivers shifted, as seasons turned. The word home would not describe a fixed place of walls and roofs, but a path, a memory of landscapes crossed again and again, familiar not because they were settled, but because they were returned to in cycles as old as the ice itself. Imagine a vast plain stretching across what is now the bottom of the sea, The Bering Strait would not be a narrow band of water but a wide land bridge, permanent and reliable, connecting Asia to the Americas like an open door. For humans and animals alike, it would be a corridor of life, a place where mammoths thundered, reindeer herds pressed forward in unending streams, and hunters followed step by step, carrying their families, their shelters, their hopes. People would cross it not once in history but countless times, back and forth, never seeing it as a barrier, but as a road laid out by the earth itself. The same would be true elsewhere. Northern Europe and Britain would not be divided by seas, but joined by broad plains, their rivers flowing not to oceans but across exposed valleys that carried the echoes of herds and footsteps. The Mediterranean would be smaller, its islands connected by walkable ground. Even Australia, today an isolated continent, might have been joined by ribbons of dry land to Southeast Asia, its people walking across open plains, where now only ocean stretches. The world would feel more connected, less fragmented, a single body of land where boundaries were marked not by water, but by the reach of ice and the exhaustion of travel. Migration in such a world would not be a once-in-a-lifetime event. It would be seasonal, constant, repeated year after year. Families would follow the same paths their ancestors had walked, learning the shapes of hills, the curves of rivers, the stars overhead that marked the way. Children would be taught not to memorize maps on paper, but to memorize the world itself. The bent tree that marked a resting place, the cliff that offered shelter from storms, the sound of a certain river that meant the herds were near. To know these signs would be to live, to forget them would be to perish. Consider the rhythm of these journeys. In spring, as the snow softened slightly, herds of reindeer would begin to move northward, seeking the fresh grasses that emerged in the short summer. Humans would follow, walking for weeks, sometimes months, moving camps each time the herds pressed on. Fires would be lit in new places each night, their smoke rising briefly before vanishing into the wide sky. In autumn, as the cold deepened again, the herds would turn south, and so would people, retracing their steps, gathering at caves or sheltered valleys where they had left markings or carvings the year before. Every year was a circuit, a great loop of survival traced over and over, a path that was both journey and home. And not all migrations would be across open plains. Some would be more treacherous, through mountain passes where glaciers loomed on either side, their creaking groans echoing through the valleys. Imagine a small band of hunters climbing narrow ridges, their footprints pressed into snow that might cover the tracks of their ancestors from decades earlier. In such places, the land itself would feel alive, shifting and unpredictable, demanding courage and patience in equal measure. Yet even here, people would adapt, learning to read the snow, to listen for avalanches, to move carefully in the shadow of ice. Animals, too, would be part of these migrations, their movements dictating the movements of humans. The mammoth paths would be highways, worn down by generations of hooves, wide enough for entire clans to follow. Reindeer trails would cut across tundra, guiding people toward food and safety. Even predators would migrate, trailing behind herds, and in turn shaping human routes, for a hunter must always be aware of being hunted. The world would be a web of intersecting journeys, each species bound to the other by invisible lines of hunger and survival. In such a world, permanence would be rare, but certain places might become sacred by virtue of being returned to again and again. A cave where paintings had been made might become a landmark, visited each season, its walls slowly filling with generations of art and memory. A certain valley where herds always passed might be seen as a gift from the spirits, a place where the hunt never failed. These places would not be owned but remembered, woven into stories and rituals that turned geography into heritage. Migration would not erase belonging, it would redefine it. Belonging would mean not claiming a patch of land but knowing the paths that tie land together. The act of moving itself would shape culture. Songs would be sung to keep pace during long walks. Chants repeated to comfort children carried on backs. Stories told to explain why rivers ran in one direction and not the other. A journey of hundreds of miles would not be seen as an ordeal but as life unfolding. A child born during a migration might be named for the place of their first cry, carrying that moment forward into the next journey. Death, too, would be part of the path. Graves would dot the migration routes, marked not by stone but by memory, stories ensuring that no one was forgotten even as the living pressed onward. It is worth pausing to imagine how different humanity's story would feel in such a world. In our timeline, cities tied people to specific places, to walls, to soil, to rivers. But in this endless ice age, the city would never arrive. Humanity would remain tied to movement, to the sky above and the land beneath, to paths walked again and again until they became part of the body's memory. Identity itself might be shaped not by territory but by trail, by the distances one's people walked, by the landmarks they carried in their minds. We would not be creatures of rootedness, but creatures of return, our culture as fluid as the herds we followed. And yet, there would be beauty in this endless movement. Picture a long line of travellers silhouetted against the pale horizon, their figures small beneath the vast sky. Imagine the crunch of footsteps in snow, the soft murmur of voices, the occasional laughter that breaks the silence. Imagine the fire at night, a small circle of light in the dark, the stars wheeling above as constant guides. In such a life, every horizon would hold promise, every journey would carry meaning, and every return to a familiar place would feel like the closing of a circle. In a frozen earth that never warmed, migration would not be history, it would be eternity. Humanity would be defined not by cities built or walls raised, but by paths walked, by trails remembered, by the ceaseless movement that bound us to animals, to seasons, and to the earth itself. And in that movement, we might find a different kind of belonging not to a single patch of ground, but to the great unending journey across the frozen face of the world. 8. Agriculture delayed. In our world, the retreat of the Ice Age opened the ground for something entirely new, the quiet revolution of agriculture. As glaciers melted, valleys filled with fertile soil, rivers carved dependable paths, and climates softened into rhythms that allowed seeds to take root and flourish. But in a world where the Ice Age never ended, that moment would never arrive. The soil would remain locked in frost, the rivers shallow and fleeting beneath sheets of ice, and the climate too unpredictable to nurture crops. Humanity's great leap into farming would be delayed, perhaps forever, leaving us bound to a different way of living. Imagine walking across a tundra where the ground never truly thaws. Beneath a thin surface of moss and grasses lies permafrost, hard as stone, refusing the plough. Even if seeds were scattered, they would never sprout, or if they did, the growing season would be far too short to yield enough food. The summer is brief, a flicker of warmth that melts the topsoil but never penetrates deeper. By the time shoots rise, frost creeps back again, halting growth before it begins. For humans, the dream of fields heavy with grain, of orchards bending under fruit, would never take root in imagination. It would remain an impossibility, a story not yet told. This absence of farming changes everything. No villages rising around cultivated fields, no permanent homes clustered near irrigation canals, no granaries filled with surplus. Instead, people remain wanderers, following herds, gathering what they can, living from season to season without the certainty of storage. Food is not grown, it is pursued, found, taken, shared. The idea of abundance, of harvest festivals, of stored security through winter, does not exist. Instead, survival is a matter of mobility and memory, of knowing where to walk and when to move. But this is not only about food. Agriculture shaped not just diets, but the very structure of civilization. Writing, cities, kingdoms, all followed the stability of farming. Without it, culture takes a different path. Stories are still told, but not written down. They move like people move, carried in voices, shifting slightly with each retelling, living in memory rather than on stone or parchment. Technology develops slowly, bound to what can be carried, not what can be built. The wheel may exist, but roads would not. Metal might be discovered, but not smelted in great furnaces that require permanent settlements. Progress becomes patient, stretched thin across centuries, because the land does not permit people to stay long enough in one place to concentrate knowledge or labour. Religion, too, would look different. In our world, farming tied belief to cycles of planting and harvest, to gods of fertility and sun, to rituals of rain and growth. In a frozen earth, spirituality remains tied to movement, to animals, to survival. The mammoth becomes sacred, not the seed. The aurora becomes a message, not the rainfall. Fire remains the closest thing to divinity. the only true harvest that humans can guarantee. Belief grows not from fields but from the struggle against hunger and cold, shaping myths that honor endurance instead of abundance. Now think of art in such a world. Without fields to settle around, art would not rise in stone temples or carved monuments. It would remain in caves, on portable objects, in songs sung during migration. Carvings of bone and ivory would be carried as charms, passed down through families as treasures of survival. Paintings would bloom on the walls of shelters revisited year after year, each generation adding its marks to the same surfaces, creating a slow dialogue across centuries. Art would remain intimate, personal, tied to movement, never the monumental expression of farming societies that could build and decorate on vast scales. The delay of agriculture also delays population growth. Without fields to sustain thousands in one place, human groups remain small, rarely more than a few dozen travelling together. The world feels emptier, vaster, more silent. Encounters between groups are rarer, and when they happen, they are fraught with tension but also rich with exchange. Tools, stories, ornaments, even mates might be traded in these brief meetings before each group moves again along its path. Humanity remains scattered, spread thin across continents, its voice soft compared to the roar of animals and the whisper of the wind. And yet, there would be advantages. The diseases that flourished in dense farming societies, plagues born from close contact with animals and crowded cities, might never emerge. Life is shorter because of hunger and cold, but perhaps also freer of the great epidemics that scarred our history. The air remains cleaner, the rivers clearer, because cities never pollute them. The forests that would have been cleared for fields remain standing, though stunted and sparse in the cold. The earth feels larger, less burdened by human presence, still dominated by ice, wind, and animal life. Still, one wonders what kinds of experiments might occur in this alternate world. Perhaps along the edges of glaciers, in valleys warmed by volcanic heat or coastal plains, where summers last a little longer, people might try to coax plants from the soil. Small gardens, fragile and precious, could exist in pockets, feeding a few families but never spreading into wide fields. These attempts would be rare, vulnerable to frost, often failing. But in them lies the spark of possibility, a whisper of the path we know but delayed, deferred, always threatened by the unyielding cold. Think of how long such a delay could last. Thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years with no farming, no cities, no written records. Humanity might still be here, but in a form almost unrecognizable to us. A species that tells stories but does not write them, that sings songs but does not record them, that remembers paths but does not draw maps. Civilization, as we define it, would be frozen in waiting, held back by the same ice that shapes the land. And yet, perhaps there is something humbling, even beautiful in this thought. Agriculture made us builders and conquerors, but it also tied us to the land in ways that transformed it, often painfully. In a frozen world, we remain closer to the Earth's rhythms, smaller in number, less disruptive, more in balance with the creatures we share the world with. Life is harder, yes, but also simpler, bound not to fields but to fire, not to surplus but to sharing, not to permanence but to movement. So, if Earth had never left the Ice Age, agriculture would be delayed perhaps indefinitely. The world we know, with its cities, its technologies, its written histories, might never have come to pass. Instead, humanity would remain a wandering people, forever bound to the herds, forever listening to the skies, forever moving across the frozen face of the earth in search of warmth, food, and one another. And in that endless delay, a different kind of wisdom might emerge, not the wisdom of growth, but the wisdom of endurance, the quiet knowledge that survival itself is enough. 9. Cities that never rise. Imagine for a moment the world without cities, not because they were destroyed or abandoned, but because they never had the chance to exist. In the frozen earth where the Ice Age never ended, the dream of building something permanent from stone and timber would never have taken root. The ground would be too hard, the climate too harsh, and the need for constant movement too strong. Humanity would remain a wandering species, carrying its homes on its back, never settling long enough to watch a town grow into a city. The skyline as we know it, spires, domes, towers, would be nothing but an unimagined possibility. Think of what that absence would mean. In our history, Cities became the gathering points of human life. They were places where trade flourished, where art and politics were concentrated, where knowledge could be stored and passed on. In the frozen earth, all of that would remain scattered, diluted across small groups that never lingered in one place long enough to build walls or monuments. Trade would happen not in bustling markets but in rare encounters on migration routes, a handful of goods exchanged between clans before each moved on. The voices of thousands rising together in a single place would never be heard. The earth would remain quieter, broken only by the sound of wind, fire, and footsteps. Picture walking across a tundra and coming upon a human settlement. In our world, such a discovery might mean streets, houses, fields stretching outward, but here it would mean nothing more than a cluster of hides stretched across wooden frames, fires glowing faintly inside. The camp would be temporary, built to last a season at most, ready to be dismantled and carried away as the herds moved. There would be no stone walls, no permanent roads, no temples rising into the sky. Even the shelters would vanish once abandoned, their poles reused, their hides taken, leaving almost no trace behind. If you passed through again a year later, you would find only ashes and footprints. Without cities, the idea of ownership itself would feel different. Land would not be claimed or divided, because no one could stay long enough to enforce such claims. The earth would feel open, shared by animals and humans alike, traversed rather than possessed. Conflict would still occur, but not over borders marked on maps. Maps would not even exist. Instead, tension might arise over herds, over scarce resources found along a route, over the need to pass through a valley or mountain pass at the same time as another group. Yet even these conflicts would dissolve quickly, because movement prevents permanence. Rivalries would fade into distance, resolved not by walls or treaties but by the endless horizon. Think, too, of how knowledge would be shaped in a world without cities. In our history, libraries, schools, and temples became keepers of memory. They gathered words, carved them into stone or pressed them into clay, and allowed ideas to survive across generations. In a frozen earth, there would be no such places. Knowledge would live only in people, in memory. In the fragile chain of oral tradition, elders would become the libraries, their stories the scrolls. To lose an elder would not only mean grief but the loss of history itself, of the knowledge of migration paths, of the secrets of tools, of the stories that held identity together. Ideas would travel as slowly as people travelled, moving not across shelves but across footsteps, carried from one group to another during rare meetings. Art would also remain transient. Without cities, there would be no towering statues, no palaces decorated with carvings, no galleries filled with paintings. Instead, art would live in caves, in portable objects, in songs that echoed briefly and then vanished into the air. A figure carved from mammoth ivory might be carried for generations, passed from parent to child, its meaning growing with each hand it touched. A painting on a cave wall would be visited again, only if migration paths returned to that cave, its images deepening with layers of pigment added by later hands. Music would not be preserved in notation but remembered in voices, songs shifting subtly over time but retaining their heart through the act of repetition. Without cities, religion too would look different. There would be no temples built from stone, no pyramids rising toward the sky, no ziggurats dominating the horizon. Worship would happen under open skies, around fires, or in the shelter of caves. Sacred places would not be built but found groves of ancient trees, springs of unfrozen water, cliffs where the auroras shone most brightly. Rituals would be simple, portable, woven into the rhythms of daily life rather than tied to monumental structures. Spirituality would remain close to the earth, intimate, shaped by survival rather than by the grandeur of architecture. And what of power? In our history, cities allowed leaders to emerge, to gather wealth and armies, to rule over vast territories. In the frozen world, such concentrations of power would be impossible. Leadership would be fluid, based on skill and survival, on the ability to lead a hunt, to find a safe path, to keep the fire burning in the storm. Authority would be temporary, respected, but not enshrined in buildings or monuments. There would be no kings, no empires, no bureaucracies carved into stone. Humanity would remain egalitarian in ways that cities later eroded, each person's worth measured not by title but by contribution to survival. One might wonder what humanity would miss without cities. Science, as we know it, would never emerge, because science requires accumulation, the careful storing of observations, experiments, and results. Technology would advance, but at a pace so slow it would feel almost timeless, bound to the limits of oral teaching and small-scale invention. There would be no sudden bursts of innovation, no industrial revolutions, no skyscrapers or space travel. But perhaps in that slowness, there would be another kind of wisdom, a deeper attention to the cycles of nature, a patience born of necessity. The Earth itself would look different without cities. There would be no sprawling lights visible from space, no smoke rising from factories, no scars of highways cutting across continents. The land would remain shaped by ice and wind, not by stone and steel. Forests and tundra would stretch uninterrupted, herds would roam freely, rivers would flow unblocked by dams or bridges. The planet would feel less burdened, its rhythms less disrupted. Humanity's presence would be faint, a whisper compared to the roar of glaciers. Yet, even in this absence, there would still be beauty. Imagine a night spent under the auroras, the campfire crackling as voices rise in song, the stars wheeling above. Imagine the feeling of belonging not to a city, but to the earth itself, to the migration paths walked by ancestors, and to the endless horizons ahead. Imagine stories told not of buildings raised, but of journeys made, of animals honoured, of survival shared. Civilization in this frozen world would be no less meaningful for lacking cities. It would simply take a different shape, lighter, less permanent, but perhaps more intimately tied to the land. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, cities would never have risen. The skyline of humanity would be the horizon itself, wide and empty, stretching into forever. And in that absence, people would learn a different kind of permanence, not built from stone but carried in memory, in story, in the endless act of walking together across the frozen face of the world. 10. Cultures of the cold. In a world that never left the Ice Age, culture would not be woven into stone walls or etched into tablets, but into the very breath of survival. It would be carried in voices that rose against the howl of the wind, in dances that echoed the movement of herds, in paintings hidden deep inside caves where firelight flickered. The cultures of the cold would be shaped not by the abundance of harvests or the permanence of cities, but by the stark reality of ice and the quiet endurance of those who lived beneath it. Imagine a gathering at the end of a long migration. Families cluster around a central fire, their clothing layered with furs, their hands busy sewing, carving, or shaping stone. Children listen intently as elders tell the stories of the land, how the mammoth came to be, how the stars took their places in the sky, how the first fire was stolen from spirits who guarded it jealously. These stories are not written, yet they carry weight, repeated over and over until they become truth, binding generations together. In such a world, memory itself is culture, passed mouth to ear, fire to fire, ensuring that the wisdom of survival does not fade. The rhythms of these cultures would be slow but steady. Music would rise not from orchestras or instruments of metal, but from bone flutes and stretched high drums, their sounds resonating with the beat of feet moving across frozen ground. Songs would be long, repetitive, meant to carry across distances and to anchor memory. A chant could describe a hunting ground, a song could recount the migration route of reindeer, and in the act of singing, knowledge would be preserved. In a world where nothing could be written down, rhythm itself becomes a kind of script, guiding the body as much as the mind. Art would thrive despite the cold, or perhaps because of it. In the dark hollows of caves, humans would leave their visions behind in ochre and charcoal. Mammoths, bison, and reindeer painted on stone would not be decorations, but invocations, prayers to ensure abundance, tributes to the animals that gave life. Hands pressed against the walls, outlined in pigment, would be signatures of presence. I was here, and I endured. Carvings from ivory or bone, small figures of humans or animals, would serve as talismans, carried from place to place, links between individuals and the greater world of spirits. In these objects, fragile but enduring, we see culture not as luxury but as necessity, an anchor of meaning in the face of endless ice. Religion in these cultures would be inseparable from survival. The gods would not dwell in heavens of gold or palaces of light, but in the fire that warms, the aurora that dances, the beast that offers its flesh. Spirits would live in the wind, in the mountains, in the glaciers themselves. their power felt in every storm, every crack of ice, every long night without warmth. Rituals would be simple but profound, songs sung before a hunt, offerings left after a kill, fires tended with reverence as if they were living beings. Death would not be an end but a return, a merging with the land, with the ancestors who had walked the same paths. Spirituality would be intimate, immediate, woven into every act of survival. Social bonds in these cultures would be strong, born from necessity. Small groups traveling together would depend utterly on one another, and trust would be the foundation of life. Decisions would be made by consensus, guided by elders whose memories stretch back farther than anyone else's. Leadership would not be a throne or a crown, but a voice that steadied others in times of danger. Cooperation would outweigh competition, because without it, no one could endure. Generosity would be remembered for generations, and betrayal would be equally long-lasting. Culture here would be defined not by hierarchy but by kinship, by the web of relationships that tied people together in the face of cold. Even leisure would be shaped by survival. A rare moment of rest would not mean idleness, but storytelling, singing, carving, or teaching. Children would play by imitating hunts, throwing miniature spears at snow figures, practicing the skills they would one day need. Games might involve memorization or mimicry, ways of training minds as well as bodies. Laughter would not be rare. Even in hardship it would be a relief, a way of keeping the heart alive against the weight of endless winter. Humor would become a kind of resilience, a spark of warmth that could travel as far as any fire. These cultures of the cold would also be remarkable for their adaptability. Each group would carry knowledge specific to its landscape, how to hunt on open plains, how to find shelter in mountains, how to read the skies for weather shifts. Over generations, this knowledge would accumulate, forming a library without walls, contained in memory and practice skill. When groups met one another, knowledge would be exchanged as eagerly as goods. A new tool, a new song, a new way of stitching hides could mean the difference between survival and starvation. In this way, culture would spread not through conquest or trade routes, but through brief moments of contact on long migrations. We might think of these cultures as fragile, but they would be strong in ways we struggle to understand. They would not measure success in buildings or monuments, but in endurance, in the ability to keep going. A culture that could survive 10,000 winters without losing its thread of stories, its rhythms of song, its bonds of kinship. Such a culture is not weak, but resilient beyond measure. It may not leave behind ruins for archaeologists to marvel at, but it would leave behind something less visible and more profound. Continuity, the unbroken line of human presence in a world that never relented. Imagine, finally, how identity would feel in such cultures. To belong would not mean living in a particular city or serving a particular ruler. It would mean walking the same paths your ancestors walked, knowing the same stars, singing the same songs by the fire. It would mean being part of a story that stretches not through monuments or written records, but through memory carried in flesh and voice. In the endless cold, culture would not be fragile. It would be the warmth that kept humanity alive, the invisible fire that burned within, as vital as the flames that flickered against the frozen dark. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, the cultures of the cold would be our inheritance. We would be storytellers and singers, hunters and gatherers, wanderers bound together by shared endurance. Our monuments would not rise toward the sky, but live in our voices, our hands, our footsteps across the snow. And in that way, perhaps, culture would feel less like something built and more like something lived, carried through the long winter, not as a possession, but as the essence of what it means to be human. 11. Seas rich with life. When we picture a frozen Earth, it is easy to imagine a barren world, a planet smothered by silence and absence. But the seas, even in such a cold age, would not be empty. They would be altered, reshaped, but still alive, perhaps more alive in certain ways than we might expect. If the Ice Age had never ended, the oceans would have been smaller, their levels drawn down into the glaciers, yet they would still hold a vast and thriving community of creatures, tuned not to warmth but to chill, not to plenty but to persistence. The seas of this frozen Earth would be rich with life of their own kind, life that would shape the rhythms of the world above as surely as the glaciers did. Imagine standing on the edge of one of these ancient coastlines. The sea is colder, darker, and more turbulent than the oceans we know today, Great sheets of ice carve from glaciers and drift into the water, cracking and booming as they break free. The water foams where they fall, and the surface shivers with waves that ripple outward for miles. Yet beneath those waves, the ocean is alive, pulsing with movement and sound. Whales trace their migrations along the edges of the ice, their songs resonating through the water like distant bells. Seals slip between flows, their sleek bodies adapted perfectly to the freezing chill. Fish glitter in vast shoals, flashing silver beneath the dim surface light, their scales catching whatever sun manages to pierce the cold waters. Life here thrives on contrasts. Where cold water meets slightly warmer currents, nutrients rise to the surface, feeding plankton blooms so large they can be seen from far above. These plankton feed everything else, supporting entire webs of life that stretch upward into creatures of astonishing size. Krill swarm in such numbers that they turn the water pink or red, and in turn, whales arrive to feast. Their mouths agape, straining millions of tiny creatures in each pass. In a frozen earth, the abundance of these creatures might even surpass what we know today, because cold waters often hold more nutrients, churning constantly under the restless winds. Picture seabirds wheeling above the waves, their cries sharp against the silence of the glaciers. They dive suddenly, striking the surface with precision, their wings flaring as they carry fish back into the air. Colonies would crowd along icy cliffs, thousands of birds nesting together, their lives bound to the cycles of the sea. Penguins in the south, puffins in the north, gulls, cormorants, albatrosses, the air itself would be alive with their calls. In this frozen earth, the coasts would not be empty but ringing with their voices, each sound a thread in the tapestry of life that the sea sustains. And then, the great predators. Picture an orca breaking the surface, its black and white body cutting through the waves, its breath a mist against the cold air. In a frozen world, they would still be rulers of the seas, hunting seals, fish, even whales, their intelligence guiding them through complex hunts. Sharks, too, would still circle in the depths, though their ranges might be altered, drawn closer to the equator where waters remain slightly warmer. Life would reorganize itself, but it would not disappear. Instead, it would adapt, finding niches in the cold as it always has. For humans living in such a world, the seas would be both gift and challenge. Without fields to farm, without the possibility of growing food in frozen soil, the ocean would become an essential partner in survival. Coastal people would learn to fish, to hunt seals, to follow the migrations of whales. Boats might still be made not for exploration across vast oceans, but for moving along icy coasts, for reaching the places where fish gathered most abundantly. The sea would be a provider, but also a danger. Storms would be fierce, icebergs unpredictable, and the cold itself deadly. To live by the sea would mean to live with constant respect for its moods, never forgetting its power. Imagine a small group of humans on the coast of this frozen earth. Their camp is built close to the water, their hides stitched into shelters against the wind. By day, they launch narrow boats made from bones and skins, gliding silently across the waves to fish or hunt seals. Nets made of twisted sinew drift in the water, traps are set in tidal pools, spears tipped with bone are thrown at surfacing creatures. At night, the sea is their soundtrack. The crash of waves, the groan of shifting ice, the calls of unseen animals echoing in the darkness. Their survival is not rooted in land, but in water, in the life that stirs just beneath the surface. Culturally, the sea would shape imagination as much as the land. Stories would grow around whales, their vast shapes imagined as guardians or spirits of the deep. The auroras reflected in the water might be seen as messages from beings who lived beneath the waves. Seals could be woven into myths as creatures who crossed between worlds, half human in some tales, gifts of the ocean in others. The sea would not be a void but a presence, mysterious, sacred, feared and revered. Where farming societies told stories of gods of harvest and growth, the cultures of this frozen world would tell stories of sea spirits, of fish that taught humans to survive, of tides that marked the rhythm of time. And yet, there would be absences. The coral reefs that dazzle us today with colour and complexity would not flourish in these cold seas. Many of the tropical species we take for granted would never exist. Instead, biodiversity would cluster in cold water ecosystems, less flamboyant but no less abundant. Life would favour resilience over beauty, hardiness over delicacy. The seas of this frozen earth might seem austere to our eyes, but they would be rich in their own way, full of creatures perfectly tuned to thrive in the cold. Over thousands of years, the relationship between humans and these seas would deepen. Skills would be honed, passed down from parent to child: how to carve a boat frame from driftwood, how to read the movement of birds to find fish below, how to follow whale migrations, how to prepare skins to keep water out. Communities might even become semi-nomadic along coasts, moving by sea instead of land, following the resources the ocean offered. In a world where agriculture never began, the sea could become the closest thing to a field, its harvest taken not by plough but by net, spear, and patience. And so, when we imagine this frozen earth, it is important not to see it as empty but as full in different ways. The seas would remain vibrant, sustaining life that humans depended upon, shaping cultures, and filling the horizon with movement. Rich with life, these waters would be both sustenance and story, reminding humanity that even in a world dominated by ice, there is always abundance hidden beneath the surface. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, the seas would have been smaller, colder, and harsher, yet still overflowing with life. They would have offered food, inspiration, and mystery, drawing people to their edges, binding them to rhythms larger than themselves. In the silence of ice, the oceans would still sing the deep, resonant song of life, continuing, adapting, thriving, no matter how cold the world became. 12. Technology in the Ice Age. In a frozen world where the Ice Age never ended, technology would not vanish, but it would evolve along a different path, shaped entirely by the demands of survival. The inventions of humanity would not rise toward machines of metal or towers of glass, but would remain grounded in the simple, ingenious ways of adapting to cold, scarcity, and constant movement. Where our history saw agriculture give rise to cities, industry, and eventually electricity, this alternate world would hold a slower, quieter kind of progress. Tools and techniques honed not to master the earth, but to endure within it. Picture a hunter in this frozen world. His spear is made from wood hardened in fire, tipped with stone chipped to a razor edge, and lashed tightly with sinew. Every part of it is the product of technology, though simple in form. The stone has been carefully chosen, split with patient strikes that reveal sharp flakes. The wood has been selected from the rare trees hardy enough to grow near the tundra, shaped and smoothed for balance. The sinew has been taken from an animal, cleaned, twisted, and stretched until it becomes a thread strong enough to bind the weapon. To hold such a spear is to hold generations of knowledge, accumulated slowly, passed hand to hand, refined by the necessities of cold and hunger. Fire itself is perhaps the greatest technology of the Ice Age. In our world it became ordinary, but in a frozen earth it would always remain sacred, an invention renewed with each generation. The skill of striking sparks from flint and steel, or from stone and pyrite, would be practiced endlessly. A child might spend hours learning to coax smoke from dry grasses, to feed the smallest flame until it became a blaze. Fire would be more than warmth. It would be a tool for cooking, a defense against predators, a way to shape other tools. Bones could be hardened in its glow, stones cracked open, hides softened by its heat. Every fire built would be a small act of technological triumph against the cold world pressing in from all sides. Shelter, too, would be technology. Imagine hides stretched across frames of wood or bone, sewn together with sinew and weighted down with snow for insulation. Inside, lamps fueled by animal fat would glow, their light flickering against walls decorated with drawings. In colder regions, shelters might even be dug into the ground, lined with furs, the earth itself becoming a layer of insulation. These homes would not last long, but they would be portable, ready to move with each migration. Technology in this world would mean flexibility structures that could be carried, dismantled, or rebuilt wherever the herds led. Clothing would be another marvel. Where we see garments as style, here they would be survival engineered with precision. Layers of fur and hide would be stitched together using bone needles and sinew thread, each seam tight to keep out the wind. Boots would be lined with grass or moss for insulation, mittens made from overlapping hides, hoods designed to trap warmth around the face. Decoration would still exist. Beads, carved pendants, dyed patterns, but always woven into the functional, never separate from it. A beautiful coat would also be a warm one, an ornamented boot also a shield against frostbite. Technology and art would be inseparable, both serving the same need, to keep the body alive. Weapons and hunting tools would grow more varied. Spears would be joined by atlatls, devices for throwing them farther and harder. Bows might emerge slowly, strung with sinew, their arrows tipped with flint or bone. Nets and snares would be designed to catch smaller animals, fish traps woven from reeds or branches to secure food from rivers. Each invention would expand the possibilities of survival, but all would remain rooted in simplicity, in the use of what could be found and carried. The frozen earth would never allow for excess tools, would be light, portable, essential. Even transport would be touched by technology. Sleds, drawn by dogs or pulled by people themselves, would carry loads across snow. Skins stretched over frames might become the first boats, light enough to be lifted, strong enough to ride the cold waters near the coast. Snowshoes, woven from wood and hide, would spread weight across deep drifts, allowing travellers to move where otherwise they would sink. Each of these is a small but profound answer to the environment, a way of turning hardship into possibility. And yet, without agriculture, technology would not accelerate in the same way it did in our history. There would be no surpluses of food to free people for specialised labour, no permanent settlements where invention could gather momentum. Discovery would still occur, but slowly, scattered across groups separated by vast distances. One group might perfect a new kind of spearhead, another might learn to build sturdier shelters, a third might shape better clothing. These ideas might spread when groups met along migration paths, exchanged goods, or shared stories around fires. Technology would be communal, collaborative, not owned or hoarded. Progress would be slow but shared, passed from group to group as naturally as stories or songs. It is tempting to imagine that such a frozen humanity would be stagnant, but stagnation is the wrong word. Life in the Ice Age would demand constant innovation, constant refinement, constant adaptation. Every hunt is an experiment, every shelter a design tested by wind and snow, every fire a lesson in patience. The pace is not fast, but it is steady, woven into survival itself. Technology here would not be about surpassing nature, but about listening to it, learning its patterns and finding ways to live within them. What would be absent are the technologies of abundance metallurgy, large-scale agriculture, engines, machines. Without the chance to settle, humanity would not smelt iron or harness steam. Without dense populations, there would be no need for writing or bureaucracy. But in their absence, there would still be ingenuity, still creativity, still the drive to make existence not only bearable, but meaningful. A beautifully carved bone tool, a perfectly sewn hide coat, a fire kept alive for weeks without failing. These would be as much a triumph of technology as any skyscraper or engine, judged not by complexity but by necessity. Imagine how such technologies would shape culture. Knowledge of how to stitch, how to carve, how to spark fire would be treasured as much as myths and stories. The skilled hunter, the careful seamstress, the clever toolmaker would hold as much respect as leaders or elders. Technology would not be separated from daily life. It would be life, the invisible foundation that made survival possible. Each invention would be remembered, passed down, improved upon, never forgotten, because forgetting would mean death. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, technology would still have been our companion. It would have grown slower, smaller, quieter, but always present, always adapting alongside us. The frozen Earth would not be without invention. It would simply hold invention in a different form, one that valued survival over progress, patience over speed, balance over mastery. And perhaps in that restraint, in that endless refining of simple things, there would be a kind of wisdom technology, not as a way to dominate the world, but as a way to live with it, step by step, fire by fire, in the unending winter. 13. Alternative civilizations. When we think of civilization, we usually imagine stone cities, busy markets, temples rising into the sky, and roads stretching across continents. But if the Ice Age had never ended, none of these would have come to pass. Civilization, as we define it, would have taken a different shape, born not from fields and surplus, but from movement and memory. The endless cold would not prevent humans from building cultures, communities, and ways of living larger than themselves. but those civilizations would look nothing like the ones we know. Imagine for a moment a world without permanence. No cities to anchor generations, no monuments to withstand centuries, no walls to guard borders. Instead, civilizations would be living things, moving across the land like migrating herds, flexible, resilient, and ever-changing. They would not be tied to stone foundations, but to trails, rivers, and seasons. A civilization here would not be measured in buildings, but in the scope of its journeys, the knowledge it carried, and the stories it wove into the land. These alternative civilizations might be built on migration paths, their boundaries defined not by walls but by distance travelled. One group might move in a great circuit of 1,000 miles, following herds across plains and returning to the same caves each generation to leave paintings and symbols as markers of belonging. Another might live along the coast, travelling by boat from inlet to inlet, harvesting fish and seals, their lives bound to tides rather than fields. Another still might thread through mountain passes, carrying with them songs that describe each valley, each glacier, each star that guides their way. To belong to such a civilization would mean knowing the path, knowing the rhythm, knowing the landmarks that shaped life. In place of cities, there would be gathering grounds, certain valleys where herds converged, certain rivers where fish swam abundantly, and certain cliffs where caves offered shelter. These would become the centers of human life, not permanent settlements, but seasonal hubs. Every year, dozens of groups might converge on these places, trading goods, exchanging songs, arranging marriages, telling stories that spread news across vast distances. Then, as quickly as they gathered, they would disperse again, carrying with them the echoes of those meetings. Civilization in this frozen earth would be cyclical, swelling and fading like the breath of the seasons. Without agriculture, surplus would be rare, but knowledge would be abundant. Civilizations of the cold would build libraries not of stone and scrolls, but of memory. Elders would be walking archives, their minds storing the roots of migrations, the techniques of tool-making, the rituals of hunting, the stories of ancestors. Knowledge would travel through songs, chants, and dances, encoded in rhythm so it could not be forgotten. A story might describe the path of stars across the sky. A chant might recount the order of steps in crafting a spear. A dance might teach the movements of animals in the hunt. In this way, civilizations would preserve their wisdom not in monuments, but in bodies, in voices, in rituals. Art would become a binding thread across these civilizations. Caves would be sacred galleries, revisited again and again, each generation adding new layers of images over old ones. Mammoths, reindeer, wolves, and humans would move across those walls like echoes of memory, binding past and present together. Portable art would also flourish, small carvings from bone, pendants of ivory, beads strung in patterns that signaled identity and lineage. These objects would travel as people traveled, crossing continents, exchanged between groups, spreading styles and symbols across the frozen world. Civilization would not be static. It would be dynamic, carried along migration paths as surely as fire and food. Religion in these civilizations would be deeply tied to the land. The great ice sheets themselves might be imagined as deities, eternal presences shaping the world. Herd animals would be revered as gifts of the spirits, their cycles of migration viewed as sacred. The auroras would be seen as messages from ancestors, the stars as maps drawn by divine hands. Rituals would happen at gathering grounds or at special landmarks, a certain cave, a certain spring, a certain ridge of stone. Civilization here would not build temples but would treat the world itself as sacred space, each place layered with meaning, each journey infused with reverence. What about leadership? In our history, civilizations grew around kings, queens, and hierarchies, but in a frozen world, power would be more fluid. Leaders might rise for the hunt, chosen for their skill and wisdom, then fade back into the group when their task was done. Authority would be temporary, shifting with circumstance, because no one could accumulate enough wealth or permanence to rule for long. Instead of kingdoms, there would be networks of clans, alliances sealed by marriages, stories, or rituals. Civilization here would be decentralized, woven together not by thrones but by trust. Trade would exist, but in a different form. Instead of markets crowded with goods, trade would happen during seasonal gatherings, with tools, hides, ornaments, and knowledge exchanged between groups. A new technique for sewing hides might spread across continents in this way, carried by word of mouth, demonstrated in one place and remembered in another. Trade would not be about wealth but about survival, ensuring that knowledge and resources flowed across the frozen world. And yet, despite these differences, such civilizations would still be grand in their own way. They would leave behind fewer ruins, but their mark would be no less profound. The migration paths themselves would be their monuments, the trails worn by countless footsteps across millennia. The stories carried in songs would be their literature, the paintings deep in caves their libraries, the rituals beneath the stars their temples. Civilization would still mean the gathering of people, the creation of meaning, the passing down of knowledge. It would simply be lighter, less permanent, more attuned to the rhythms of ice and sky. In this frozen earth, civilizations would not be measured in walls or wars, but in endurance. They would be judged not by how high they built, but by how long they remembered, how far they travelled, how deeply they honoured the land. And perhaps, in this alternate story, humanity would find a different kind of greatness, one not rooted in conquest or empire, but in balance, in resilience, in the quiet continuity of culture that moves like breath across the cold. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, our civilizations would not be absent, but transformed. They would be mobile, oral, sacred, communal. They would not leave behind towering ruins for archaeologists to uncover, but they would leave behind something more elusive, the living memory of a species that learned to thrive, not by bending the world to its will, but by moving with it, following its rhythms, and carrying its stories across the frozen expanse of time. 14. Language and storytelling. In a frozen world where the Ice Age never ended, words would be as vital as fire. They would be the sparks that lit minds, the threads that wove communities together, the maps by which people navigated not only the land but their own place in it. Without writing, without cities, without books or libraries, language itself would be the vessel of civilization, and storytelling would be the fabric that bound memory to meaning. In such a world, the spoken word would carry the weight of eternity. Imagine a gathering around a fire on a long winter night. Outside, the wind howls across the tundra, carrying with it the distant cries of wolves. Inside, flames flicker against the walls of a hide shelter, shadows moving as if they too are listening. A storyteller begins to speak. The children lean forward, their eyes wide. Adults, though they know the tale already, listen with the same intensity, because every telling is more than a story, it is a ritual of preservation. In these words live the lessons of survival, the memory of ancestors, the explanation of the world. To forget a story would be to lose not just entertainment but knowledge, identity, even safety. Language in this frozen earth would be shaped by the land itself. It would hold dozens of words for snow, ice, wind and fire. It would carry precise terms for animal tracks, for the quality of light at different times of year, for the tone of the sky before a storm. Every detail that mattered to survival would be woven into words, because without words the knowledge could not be passed on. Children would learn not only how to walk or hunt, but how to name, because naming is remembering, and remembering is living. Storytelling would become the memory of the people. Myths would explain why the mammoth roams, why the auroras dance, why the ice groans in the night. Legends would tell of ancestors who crossed vast plains, who discovered fire, who first learned to stitch hides against the cold. Some stories would be practical, encoding instructions in narrative form, how to find a river in the dark, how to track reindeer across snow, how to survive a blizzard. Others would be moral, teaching lessons about generosity, bravery, or respect for the animals that gave their lives. All of them together would be the library of the people, preserved not in stone but in breath. Think of how language would sound in such a world. Words would be shaped by necessity, spoken clearly over the roar of wind, shouted across plains, whispered in the intimacy of the fire. Songs would elongate sounds, making them easier to remember, easier to pass down. Rhythm and rhyme would not be luxuries but tools, ways of fixing memory and patterns the mind could not forget. A chant might hold the root of a migration, a song might preserve the lineage of a clan, a dance might embody the shape of an animal's movement. Language would not be limited to speech, it would be woven into movement, music, and ritual, a tapestry of communication that extended beyond words. Without writing, memory would be collective. No single person could hold everything. so communities would divide knowledge among their members. One elder might know the stories of the stars, another the tales of the hunt, another the songs of healing. Together, they would form a living archive, each voice carrying a fragment of the whole. When they gathered, the pieces would come together, reweaving the continuity of culture. To lose a voice in such a world would be a profound grief, because it meant losing a chapter of memory that could never be written down again. And yet, this fragility would also bring strength. In a frozen earth, stories would never be taken for granted. They would be told again and again, reinforced by ritual and performance, remembered by all, not just by scribes or scholars. A child might know by heart the same myths as their grandparents, because they had heard them spoken hundreds of times. In this way, culture would not be locked in books that only a few could read. It would be alive in everyone, carried in every voice. The themes of storytelling would reflect the world. Tales would revolve around endurance, migration, the generosity of animals, and the patience of the fire. The heroes would not be kings or conquerors, but hunters who guided their clans to safety, mothers who kept the fire alive, children who remembered paths when the stars were hidden. Trickster figures might embody the cunning of predators like wolves or foxes, teaching lessons about wit and humility. Spirits would be imagined in glaciers, in storms, in the auroras overhead, their presence woven into narratives that explained why the world remained locked in cold. Language itself might carry metaphors we would find strange. Where we say, time flows like a river, they might say, time walks like a herd, because the rhythm of their lives was measured in migration. Where we speak of roots to describe origins, they might speak of footsteps, because belonging was tied not to being rooted but to returning, again and again, to the same paths. The very structure of thought would be shaped by the experience of movement, of ice, of fire in the dark. And imagine the intimacy of storytelling in this world. In a place where nights could last for weeks, stories would be lifelines against despair. Laughter at a humorous tale would warm as much as the fire. A myth of ancestors watching in the auroras would comfort those who feared the endless dark. Stories would be medicine, binding communities together, easing the weight of survival, reminding everyone that they were part of something larger than themselves. Art and language would intertwine in these cultures. A carving of a mammoth might be accompanied by a chant describing its power. A cave painting of a hunt might be revisited each year, the story told anew as the figures were traced with fingers or voices. Words would not exist apart from images or rhythm. They would be part of a living performance, remembered through senses as much as through speech. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, our greatest monuments would not be pyramids or cathedrals, but the stories carried in memory. Civilization would not be remembered through ruins, but through language, through myths that endured across generations, through chants that encoded knowledge, through songs that held identity. We would be a species of storytellers above all else, living not in cities of stone but in cities of words, invisible yet enduring, spread across the frozen face of the earth. And perhaps that too is civilization, not walls or writing, but the unbroken chain of language, the endless circle of stories told by firelight, the human voice carrying memory across the long winter. In a frozen earth, storytelling would not be entertainment, it would be survival, identity, and meaning itself. 15. Spirituality of the ice. In a frozen world where the Ice Age never ended, spirituality would be shaped by the cold as surely as rivers are shaped by stone. The vastness of glaciers, the silence of snow, the endless skies lit with auroras would all press upon the human spirit, demanding meaning, inviting reverence. Religion here would not be born from harvests or temples, but from endurance, from fire, from the fragile yet powerful thread of life running through an environment that seemed determined to silence it. Imagine standing at the edge of a glacier that stretches beyond the horizon. The ice creaks and groans, shifting slowly, alive in its own rhythm. To those who lived beside it, this would not be mere landscape, it would be presence. A glacier might be seen as a god, an eternal being whose breath is the cold wind, whose voice is the thunder of cracking ice. To journey near it would be to approach the sacred, and rituals might be performed to honour its power, offerings left in crevasses or songs sung into the echoing valleys. The auroras would be another source of awe. Curtains of light dancing across the sky would not be understood as science, as solar winds striking the atmosphere, but as living beings. They could be ancestors watching, spirits guiding, or divine messengers carrying warnings or blessings. Entire mythologies might grow around their colours and movements. Green light could mean abundance to come, red light a sign of danger, purple light a whisper of death or rebirth. For people huddled by fire in the darkness of endless nights, these lights would be the closest thing to visible divinity, a theatre of the heavens reminding them that the world was alive with powers unseen. Fire itself would hold the central role in spirituality. In a frozen earth, fire is life, and its presence would be revered as something more than material. The ability to strike sparks, to coax flame from wood and stone, would be a sacred act, and firekeepers might serve as spiritual leaders, seen as intermediaries between humans and the divine. Rituals would surround the tending of flame prayers said when adding fuel, songs sung as sparks caught, taboos about letting the fire die. A clan might carry embers across migrations, ensuring that their fire was never fully extinguished, a living thread that connected generations. In such practices, fire would become more than survival. It would be a manifestation of the sacred, a piece of eternity glowing in human hands. Animals, too, would be at the heart of spirituality. In our history, farming cultures revered crops and fertility gods, but in this frozen world, reverence would turn to mammoths, reindeer, wolves, and bears. A successful hunt might be followed by rituals of gratitude, bones placed carefully in patterns, hides treated with respect, songs sung to thank the spirit of the animal for its gift. Myths might describe great beasts as ancestors, their strength flowing into humans who consumed their flesh. To kill would never be taken lightly. It would always carry a sense of sacred exchange, life given for life sustained. Over generations, animals might become deities in themselves. Mammoth the provider, reindeer the guide, wolf the teacher of endurance. Spiritual practices would also grow around the cycles of light and dark. In regions where the sun vanished for weeks at a time, rituals would mark its return. Fires would be kept burning through the longest nights as symbols of hope, and when the first dawn finally broke, celebrations would rise in song and dance, welcoming back the light. Conversely, in summers where the sun barely set, ceremonies might honour its ceaseless watch, thanking it for its endurance. The sky itself would be a clock and a canvas, its extremes dictating not just survival but meaning. Death in this frozen earth would be seen not as an end, but as a return. Burials might be shallow, bodies wrapped in hides and laid beneath stones, their spirits imagined as rising into the auroras or joining the herds that cross the horizon. Ancestors would be ever present, their memory invoked in rituals, their presence felt in wind and snow. A sudden storm might be explained as the anger of the dead, a calm sky as their blessing. The connection between the living and the departed would be close, immediate, unbroken, carried in stories, and in the belief that no one was ever truly gone. Without temples or cities, spirituality would remain portable, woven into the rhythms of daily life. Sacred spaces would be natural places, caves whose walls bore paintings, cliffs where the wind sang, rivers that never fully froze. Gatherings at these sites would be both practical and spiritual, moments when different groups came together to reaffirm their bonds, exchange stories, and perform rituals that honoured the powers around them. The earth itself would be the temple, its features the altars, its storms and silences the hymns. Leaders of spirituality would not be priests in robes or kings with crowns, but shamans, storytellers, firekeepers. These individuals would serve as bridges between the human and the unseen, guiding hunts with rituals, interpreting dreams, reading the signs of the sky and land. Their authority would not come from wealth or position, but from knowledge, from their ability to carry and interpret the unseen. A shaman might paint visions on cave walls, chant through the night, or perform dances that mimicked the movements of animals, blending the physical with the spiritual in acts that reinforced the connection between people and their world. The spirituality of the ice would not seek to control nature, but to harmonize with it. In a world where survival is fragile, the idea of dominion would feel absurd. Instead, humans would see themselves as participants in a larger web, their role not to command but to respect, to honor, to endure alongside. Spirituality here would be humility, the recognition that the cold was stronger than any human will, that only by aligning with the spirits of the land could one hope to survive. And yet, within this humility, there would also be strength. Spirituality would give meaning to suffering, turning hardship into ritual, scarcity into gratitude, fear into reverence. It would transform the endless cold into something more than emptiness. It would become presence, power, even beauty. To believe that the auroras were ancestors dancing, to trust that the mammoth carried divine generosity, to know that fire was a gift of the gods. These beliefs would not only comfort, they would give life a rhythm, a sense of belonging in a world that might otherwise feel hostile. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, our religions would not be built on harvests, temples, or sacred texts. They would be built on fire and ice, on stars and storms, on animals and ancestors. They would live in songs, in rituals performed under endless skies, in whispers carried by wind across frozen plains. Spirituality would be as constant as the cold, a warmth carried not in stone but in the human heart, reminding every wanderer that even in the longest winter, they were not alone. 16. The missing warmth. If Earth had remained locked in the Ice Age, there would be something absent that we, in our warm world, take so easily for granted. The embrace of true warmth. Not just the flickering of fire, not just the rare glow of sunlight reflected off ice, but the steady, lingering warmth of summer fields, the softness of rain, the generosity of fertile soil warmed by Sunday. This missing warmth would shape everything, not only the land and its creatures, but the very way humans felt about life itself. Imagine living where the sun is always thin, its strength never quite reaching the earth beneath your feet. The warmth of noon would be only a pale echo of what we know now, a brief reprieve in a day still surrounded by cold. The skin would never feel the fullness of summer heat. Instead, warmth would be fleeting, fragile, something treasured in small bursts, a fire's glow, an animal's fur, the closeness of another body. Warmth would be memory and longing, a sensation spoken of in stories more often than it was experienced. The land itself would reflect this absence. There would be no wide fields of waving grass, no forests heavy with buzzing life in the summer heat, no wetlands thick with croaking frogs and chirping insects. Instead, the ground would remain hard, grasses low, mosses thin, trees stunted or absent altogether. The sense of the earth would be sharper, cleaner, but also emptier, less rot, less bloom, fewer flowers opening to the Sunday. The symphony of sound that warmth brings, the hum of bees, the chorus of birds, the rustle of leaves in a warm breeze, would be replaced by the hush of snow, the groan of ice, the distant call of migrating herds. Warmth is not only physical, it is emotional, psychological, spiritual. In our world, people gather in summer, celebrating abundance, dancing in sunlight, feasting on crops. In the frozen world, such feasts would be unknown. Instead, celebrations would be quieter, marked by the rare moments when the sun lingered, when snow softened, when rivers thawed. These would be the sacred times, moments of reprieve, honoured with songs and rituals because they promised a glimpse of something precious, the missing warmth. People would not take heat for granted, they would treat it as miracle. Even the human body would carry the memory of warmth differently. The sensation of holding a hand close to fire, the press of skin against another during sleep, the slow thaw of frozen fingers, all of these would carry deep emotional meaning. Comfort would be inseparable from heat. To offer someone warmth would be the greatest act of kindness. Whether by sharing a cloak, a fire, or one's own body heat, warmth would become symbolic, equated with love, generosity, safety. Where in our world we speak of warm hearts and warm welcomes, in the frozen earth those phrases would be literal truths, binding communities together through the shared gift of heat. The absence of warmth would also alter imagination. Myths might speak of a golden age, not of abundance but of warmth, an ancestral time when the earth was softer, when rivers flowed freely, when the sun was strong. Whether or not such a time was remembered would matter less than the longing it inspired. Warmth would be the lost paradise, the eternal dream. Tales might describe it as a distant land beyond the horizon, where the snow melts and flowers bloom, a place few ever reach but all believe in. It would become a metaphor for hope itself, the unreachable but ever-desired promise. The missing warmth would shape relationships too. In the long, cold nights, people would press close together, not only for survival but for comfort. Bonds would be forged in the sharing of fires, in the mutual struggle against cold. Love would carry the imagery of warmth, hands held close to flames, embraces that kept the frost away, the glow of firelight on a beloved's face. Even language itself would reflect it. To describe someone as warm would mean not only kind but life-giving. To be cold might mean not only distant but dangerous. Warmth would be the ultimate symbol of humanity itself. And what of the earth without warmth? The great migrations of birds would never reach tropical forests, because those forests would not exist. Rivers would run thin, never swelling with summer rains. Flowers would be rare, muted in colour, their blossoms small and fleeting. The dazzling biodiversity of warm climates, tigers in jungles, parrots in canopies, frogs in swamps would never appear. Life would be narrower, shaped only by what could endure the cold. The very palette of Earth would be subdued whites, greys, muted greens and browns, with only the briefest touches of colour in berries, feathers, or the northern lights. The missing warmth would mean a missing exuberance, a missing abundance of form and sound. For humans, this absence would mean the delay of many things. Agriculture requires warmth, and without it, farming would never truly begin. Villages would never form, cities never rise. Technologies dependent on settled life metalworking, writing, architecture would remain unborn. The missing warmth would mean the missing path of history as we know it. Civilization would not unfold in temples and empires, but remain fluid, migratory, ephemeral, carried in voices and footsteps. The entire story of humanity would be rewritten by the absence of heat. And yet, in that absence, there would be a kind of clarity. Warmth would never be wasted, never overlooked. A patch of sun on the snow would become a place of rest, a rare treasure. The brief thaw of spring would be celebrated like a miracle. Fire would never be simply fuel, but always sacred, always alive. Human culture would orient itself not around abundance, but around appreciation, an intense awareness of the rare and fragile beauty of heat in a world otherwise dominated by cold. It is humbling to imagine how different humanity would feel in such a world. Perhaps we would be less ambitious but more grateful, less concerned with conquest but more concerned with community. The missing warmth would teach us to value what little warmth we had, to treasure firelight, to honour closeness, to cherish the fleeting glow of the Sunday. In this frozen earth, warmth would not only be survival, it would be meaning, memory and dream, the heart of what it meant to be alive. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, it would be a world forever haunted by what was missing, the steady embrace of warmth. And yet, in longing for it, humanity might find something profound, a recognition of fragility, a reverence for small mercies, a love for one another made stronger by the cold. In the missing warmth there would still be a fire, glowing not only in hearths but in the human spirit, carrying life through the endless winter. 17. Alternate evolution. In a world where the Ice Age never ended, evolution itself would have followed different paths. The Great Cold would not only shape landscapes and weather, but also the very bodies of creatures, including our own. Life adapts always to its conditions, and if those conditions had been unrelenting ice, snow, and wind, then the tree of evolution would look nothing like the one we know today. Some branches would thicken and flourish, others would wither before they ever began. Imagine first the animals. Many species that thrive in warmth would never have existed. There would be no lions chasing gazelles across golden plains, no elephants wandering through sunlit savannas, no parrots flashing bright in tropical forests. These forms of life are children of warmth, their existence tied to fertile ground, steady rains, and abundant plants. In the frozen earth, their stories would never have been written. Instead, the animals of cold would dominate mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, musk, oxen, reindeer, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats. The earth would be filled with creatures clad in fur, shaped for endurance, tuned for migration. Some species might have continued to evolve in remarkable ways. The mammoth, for instance, might have grown even larger in some regions, its thick fur and fat layers expanding in response to colder conditions. Or perhaps it would have developed more compact forms in certain environments, smaller bodies better able to move quickly across icy plains. Wolves might have grown larger and more powerful, becoming even more formidable hunters. Saber-toothed cats might have survived far longer, their fangs evolving into new shapes, their hunting strategies becoming more refined in the endless cold. The frozen world would not mean stasis, it would mean adaptation, new experiments written into bone and fur over millennia. Other animals would vanish entirely. Amphibians, reptiles, and insects that rely on heat would be confined to the narrowest bands of equatorial warmth, their diversity dramatically reduced. Tropical ecosystems as we know them would not exist, so the explosion of species that once filled jungles would never unfold. The earth would be quieter, its chorus of chirps, buzzes, and calls silenced, replaced by the steady crunch of snow, the howl of wind, and the distant thunder of herds. The missing warmth would mean missing complexity, a simpler but harsher web of life. Humans, too, would evolve differently. In our history, the spread of agriculture and settled life shaped not only societies but bodies, changing diets, immune systems, even the way our jaws and bones developed. Without farming, without permanent settlements, humans would remain closer to their Ice Age ancestors, bodies honed for survival in the cold. Stocky builds with shorter limbs would be favoured, conserving heat more efficiently. Skin would likely remain pale across much of the world, adapted to capture as much sunlight as possible during short days. Fat storage might become more efficient, enabling survival through longer winters when food was scarce. But beyond bodies, the mind itself might evolve differently. Our world was shaped by abundance, by the ability to plan harvests, store surpluses, and build upon stability. In the frozen earth, the human mind would be tuned not to excess but to endurance. Memory would become sharper, because forgetting a migration path could mean death. Cooperation would be deeply ingrained, as survival depended upon sharing warmth, food, and labour. Perhaps even our emotions would evolve differently, with greater emphasis on empathy, patience, and trust traits that make communal survival possible. Humanity would still dream, still imagine, but those dreams would be colder, leaner, shaped always by the need to endure. The absence of certain evolutionary pressures would also matter. Diseases that flourished in dense, warm populations might never emerge. Plagues like smallpox, measles, or influenza would be unknown. Human lifespans might remain short because of hunger and environment, but they would not be cut down by the same kinds of epidemics that scarred our history. The cold itself would be the greatest adversary, and evolution would favour resilience to frost, endurance in scarcity, and creativity in the face of unrelenting challenge. Alternative evolution would extend into plants as well. Without warmth there would be no vast forests of tall trees, no jungles dripping with vines, no fields of grain. Instead, life would cling low to the ground mosses, lichens, shrubs, small hardy flowers that bloomed briefly in rare summers. These plants would evolve strategies of endurance, storing energy for long winters, blooming quickly when the sun returned. Humanity's relationship with plants would be limited, never developing agriculture but always depending on what little could be gathered. Berries, roots, and mosses would remain important, but they would never dominate life as crops do now. The Earth's green mantle would be thinner, harder, more subdued, its beauty hidden in subtle resilience rather than exuberant abundance. Even the oceans would reflect alternate evolution. Colder waters, rich in nutrients, would support vast blooms of plankton and krill. Whales, seals, and fish might evolve into new forms, adapted to even harsher seas. Perhaps entirely new species of whale would emerge, larger or more efficient at filtering krill, their migrations stretching across icy oceans. Seals might diversify into forms better suited to long migrations on ice, blurring the line between land and sea life. The absence of coral reefs and tropical ecosystems would mean fewer bright fish, but the seas would still be full, their abundance cloaked in colder hues of silver, grey, and deep blue. What is most striking about this alternate evolution is not just what would exist, but what would be missing. So much of what we know, the colours of the tropics, the diversity of insects, the vast range of plants would never have come to be. Life would be less diverse, but not less alive. It would be a different kind of abundance, focused on endurance, migration, and the ability to thrive in scarcity. Evolution would not stop. It would simply flow down other paths, carving new possibilities into the frozen world. And perhaps, if we look deeper, we see that this alternate evolution might have produced a humanity more in balance with the Earth. Without agriculture, without cities, without the surpluses that fueled conquest and empire, our species might remain smaller in number, more humble in presence. We would live closer to animals, more attuned to their rhythms, our own evolution intertwined with theirs. The cold would teach us not to dominate, but but to adapt, to endure alongside rather than above. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, evolution would not be halted, but redirected. Creatures of fur and fat would dominate, while warmth-loving species would vanish or never appear. Humanity would remain hardy, migratory, empathetic, shaped by the demands of cold rather than the luxuries of warmth. The story of life would be simpler, but still profound, a tale of resilience written into every bone, every paw print, every footstep pressed into the endless snow. 18. Earth's new balance. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, the entire planet would have settled into a different kind of equilibrium. Instead of cycles of warmth and growth, instead of fields turning green and forests rising tall, the world would have found balance in ice, snow, and the unyielding patience of cold. This balance would not be gentle in the way we imagine spring or summer. It would be harsh, demanding, but steady, a rhythm of survival played out across millennia. And in its own way it would be beautiful. A different harmony, one in which every creature, every gust of wind, every spark of fire was part of the same frozen song. Picture the globe as it would look from above. Great white sheets of ice, covering much of the northern and southern hemispheres, glittering under pale sunlight. Mountain ranges draped in glaciers, their valleys carved by rivers of ice that move so slowly they seem eternal. Seas shrunken by the weight of frozen water, coastlines stretched outward, revealing plains that in our time lie hidden beneath the ocean. The equator would still hold patches of warmth, thin belts of forest and grassland where life clings more exuberantly, but these places would be rare, small islands of green in a world dominated by blue, white, and grey. The balance of the earth would not be abundance everywhere, but resilience everywhere. In this balance, every part of the ecosystem would be tuned to scarcity. Animals would migrate with precision, timing their movements to the brief windows when food was available. Plants would bloom quickly, storing energy for the long freeze to come. Predators would hone their strategies to survive long months without food, waiting for the right moment to strike. Nothing could be wasted. Every scrap of energy, every ounce of fat, every spark of warmth would be used and reused. The entire system would be efficient, lean and purposeful, stripped of excess but never empty. For humans, this new balance would define every choice. Communities would move not when they wanted to, but when the land demanded it. They would follow the herds because the herds followed the seasons, because the plants followed the sun, because the snow followed the cold. Human freedom would not mean independence from nature, but intimacy with it. To survive, people would have to know the rhythms of the land as deeply as their own heartbeat. Their calendars would not be marked by harvests or holidays, but by migrations, storms, and the return of light after darkness. This balance would also shape human values. Where our civilizations grew around accumulation of food, wealth, power, the civilizations of ice would grow around endurance and sharing. A single fire in the darkness would be worth more than gold. A shared cloak might mean survival through a blizzard. Cooperation would not be idealized but necessary. Generosity, a practical duty as well as a moral one. Communities would be small, but the bonds within them would be unbreakable, forged by the common struggle against the cold. The new balance would not reward greed, because greed could not survive in scarcity. It would reward patience, humility, and respect for one another, for the animals, for the land. And yet, this balance would not be static. Ice is not still. It shifts, cracks, melts, and refreezes. The seas would rise and fall over centuries, carving coastlines anew. Glaciers would advance and retreat in slow, grinding rhythms, reshaping valleys, erasing old paths, creating new ones. Humans and animals alike would adapt constantly, learning new routes, leaving behind old gathering grounds, adjusting to the Earth's endless restlessness. Balance here does not mean permanence, it means adaptation, the ability to bend without breaking, to endure without expecting certainty. One of the most profound differences in this balance would be the absence of the large-scale disruptions that our world has created. There would be no vast deforestation, no sprawling cities, no industrial pollution. The air would remain clean, the rivers clear, the oceans alive with fish and whales. The Earth would still be under stress, but the stress would come from natural forces, the ice pressing down on land, the storms howling across plains, the hunger of predators searching for prey. Humanity's footprint would be lighter, spread thin across continents, never heavy enough to unbalance the planet. In this frozen equilibrium, the Earth might even be healthier, less scarred by our species, more intact as a living system. Spiritually, this balance would be felt as presence. Humans would not see themselves as rulers of the world, but as part of its fragile web. They would know that their lives were tied directly to the herds, the seasons, the storms. The ice would not be enemy or obstacle, but teacher. Its lessons would be patience, humility, endurance. Its message would be clear: life is possible even in harshness, if one respects the rhythm of the land. And so, people would live not in defiance of the ice, but in companionship with it, their cultures echoing the very balance that sustained them. Of course, such a balance would mean limits. Populations would never explode into billions, because the land could not support such numbers. Technologies would never leap forward in great revolutions, because there would be no surpluses to fuel them. Empires would never rise, because permanence would never hold. To us, this might seem like stagnation, but within it there would be a different kind of progress. The refinement of survival, the deepening of knowledge, the strengthening of community. Balance here would mean not growth without end, but life without collapse, continuity without conquest. And perhaps that is the most humbling lesson of imagining this frozen earth. That balance does not always mean ease. Sometimes balance is hard, demanding, even cruel. Yet within it there is stability, a kind of peace born not from abundance but from endurance. To live in such a balance would be to live with awareness, to measure every act, to see every fire, every hunt, every shared story as part of the fragile but enduring fabric of existence. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, it would have found its new balance not in warmth and growth, but in cold and endurance. It would be a balance that asked more of every creature, every human, but one that also offered clarity, simplicity, and connection. In such a world, life would be smaller, quieter, but also steadier, more in tune with the rhythms of the planet itself. The frozen Earth would not be a broken Earth. It would be a different harmony, one in which the music of survival was the song of balance itself. 19. Humanity's destiny in ice. When we think of destiny, we often imagine a story of progress, of humanity, climbing from caves to cities, from stone tools to machines, from earthbound lives to reaching the stars. But in a world where the Ice Age never ended, destiny would take another shape. It would not be about conquering or expanding, but about enduring. It would not be a tale of empires and inventions, but of patience, memory, and the quiet persistence of life in the face of unending cold. Humanity's destiny in ice would be humbler, smaller in scale perhaps, but no less profound. Imagine thousands of generations living and dying in the same rhythm. Each winter the snow deepens, each spring the herds move, each summer brings a brief window of abundance, and each autumn prepares the people for hardship once again. To us, this repetition might seem monotonous, but to those within it, it would feel like continuity. Life would not be measured in grand leaps forward, but in the steady cycle of return, of survival secured, of stories retold. The destiny of humanity in this frozen earth would be not to change the world, but to remain within it, to become part of its endless rhythm. Communities would remain small, scattered, yet deeply connected through shared struggle. A group surviving one winter would pass down the knowledge of how to survive the next, and in this chain, humanity would continue. This was always our strength: adaptation, memory, cooperation, and in a frozen earth, those strengths would define us entirely. We would not build towers, but we would build trust. We would not leave monuments of stone, but we would leave footprints worn into migration paths, echoes of voices in caves, fire pits still blackened by long-dead flames. Our destiny would not be visible in ruins, but in the very persistence of life against the odds. And yet, destiny is not only survival, it is also imagination. Even in a world of endless ice, humanity would dream. Around the fire, children would listen to myths of warmth and light, of distant lands where the sun was stronger and the cold less cruel. These stories might begin as memory echoes of ancestors who once knew warmer days, but over generations they would become something else. Hopes, visions, longings woven into culture. Humanity's destiny in ice would be shaped as much by what was missing as by what was present. The absence of warmth, abundance, and permanence would create a longing that infused every story, every ritual, every dream. Perhaps, in time, people would imagine that destiny lay elsewhere, beyond the mountains, beyond the ice, beyond even the stars. The frozen earth might push imagination outward, toward horizons not yet reached. If the environment prevented growth in numbers or technology, the human spirit might instead expand inward, into myth, philosophy, and art. Destiny here would not be measured by machines or cities, but by depth of meaning, by the ability to find beauty and truth even in hardship. The frozen earth would force humanity to ask not, how do we rule? But, how do we endure? What do we value? Who are we when the cold takes everything but one another? Still, there is another possibility. Perhaps, even in this frozen earth, sparks of innovation would continue. Slowly, over millennia, humans might discover new ways to bend the cold to their favor. Better shelters, sturdier clothing, more effective tools for hunting and fishing. Fire carried more efficiently, boats built to glide over icy seas. Progress would be slow, but destiny does not always need speed. Humanity's path might still lead to new horizons, not of cities, but of migration expanding farther. Exploration carried not by armies but by small groups pushing into unknown lands. Our destiny could still be discovery, but of a different kind, quieter, more patient, carved not in stone but in snow. The Earth itself would also shape destiny. A frozen planet is a planet of limits. Populations could never grow endlessly. Resources would remain scarce, constraining humanity's numbers and reach. But within those limits, there might be stability. The Earth would not buckle under billions, would not be scarred by industrial excess. Instead, humanity's destiny might be one of balance, living lighter on the world, never straying far from its rhythms. We might be smaller in presence, but perhaps wiser in proportion, aware always of our place in the web of life. It is humbling to consider this version of our story. In our history, we have often imagined destiny as greatness, measured by scale, the rise of vast cities, the spread of empires, the reach of technology. But in the frozen earth, destiny would not be scale at all. It would be endurance, belonging, continuity. To survive would be the greatest achievement. To pass knowledge from one generation to the next would be the noblest act. To share warmth and food, to keep fire alive, to sing the same stories beneath auroras, that would be civilization, that would be destiny fulfilled. Even so, humanity in the ice would not be lesser. It would simply be different. Our destiny would still be to shape meaning, to create culture, to imagine beyond what was seen. We might not build pyramids, but we would paint caves. We might not write books, but we would tell stories that lasted for millennia. We might not launch rockets, but we would lift our eyes to the same stars, naming them, weaving them into myths, finding guidance in their patterns. Destiny in the frozen world would not be conquest of the outer, but mastery of the inner, the capacity to find purpose in hardship, beauty in scarcity, connection in survival. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, humanity's destiny would have been quieter, colder, smaller in number, yet vast in meaning. It would have been a destiny of endurance, of patience, of living within the rhythm of a frozen Earth instead of against it. And perhaps, in that destiny, there would be a kind of wisdom we often overlook, the understanding that to endure is itself greatness, that to live in balance with the world, no matter how harsh, is the most profound fulfillment of all. 20. A frozen legacy. If Earth had remained in its endless winter, the legacy of humanity and the world itself would be unlike anything we know. Instead of monuments rising in stone, instead of vast cities spreading across continents, instead of machines that flew or engines that roared, our legacy would be written in smaller, quieter ways, etched not into buildings but into memory, painted not across skylines but across caves, carried not in metal or glass but in song, in footsteps, in the persistence of fire against the dark. A frozen Earth would leave a frozen legacy, but it would not be empty. It would be subtle, delicate, and profound. Imagine the evidence left behind after thousands of years of human life in this frozen world. The caves would hold the deepest marks, paintings of mammoths and bison, reindeer and wolves, hands outlined in ochre, signs and symbols whose meanings might shift with generations but never lose their resonance. bones carved into figures would rest in the soil, beads of ivory strung together in patterns that told of identity, of belonging. Campsites would scatter the tundra, traces of fire pits blackened by smoke, fragments of tools chipped from stone, shelters built from mammoth bones and hides, long since collapsed but remembered in the stories of descendants. This would be humanity's legacy, not permanence, but presence, fragile but enduring across time. Animals too would shape the legacy of the frozen world. Mammoths, reindeer, direwolves, saber-toothed cats. They would not be remembered as fossils but as companions, rivals, teachers. Humanity's relationship with them would echo in myths and rituals, in the respect shown to their bones, in the songs sung before and after the hunt. They would be more than animals. They would be kin in the struggle to survive. In our world, their bones sit in museums, reminders of a vanished past. In the frozen earth, they would still walk beside us, their legacy intertwined with ours, their stories inseparable from the human story. The legacy of this frozen earth would also be ecological. Without vast deforestation, without sprawling industry, without billions consuming endlessly, the planet would remain intact in ways our world has long since forgotten. Forests in the warmer belts would survive untouched. Seas would remain rich with whales and fish. Rivers would flow without pollution. The earth would carry fewer scars, its balance preserved by the restraint of necessity. Humanity's lighter presence would be part of this legacy, a species not dominating the earth but woven into its rhythms. It would be a quieter legacy, but perhaps also a kinder one, less triumph over the land, more companionship with it. What of ideas? In our history, we often measure legacy in texts and inventions, in the preserved words of philosophers, the machines of engineers, the theories of scientists. In the frozen earth, ideas would live differently. They would not be stored in books or carved into stone, but in memory, in language, in story. The myths of ancestors, the teachings of elders, the rituals surrounding fire and hunt, these would be the intellectual inheritance of humanity. They would not be preserved in libraries, but they would endure through retelling, their power not diminished by their impermanence. The legacy of ideas here would be less about accumulation and more about continuity, keeping the chain unbroken, ensuring that each generation carried the knowledge it needed to live. There would also be a legacy of values. In the frozen earth, cooperation would not be a choice but a law of existence. Communities that shared would survive, while those that hoarded would perish. Over millennia, this would etch generosity, patience, and humility into the very fabric of humanity. Our legacy would not be of empires rising and falling, but of bonds unbroken, of people enduring together against the cold. This might mean less grandeur, but it might also mean less cruelty. Without armies, there would be no conquests. Without kings, no tyrannies. Humanity's frozen legacy would be one of connection, not domination. Still, the absence would also echo. There would be no pyramids, no cathedrals, no great walls or towers. There would be no literature in written form, no machines to span oceans or skies, no artifacts of empire. To archaeologists of the future, if such a future ever came, humanity's frozen legacy might seem faint, scattered, difficult to piece together. But within that faintness would be depth. Each painting, each tool, each story would hold the entire weight of a culture condensed into survival. The frozen earth would leave behind fewer objects, but perhaps stronger meanings, as if every artifact carried the gravity of necessity. And yet, legacy is not only what is left behind, it is also how life feels to those living it. In the frozen earth, legacy would be experienced in the warmth of fire shared among family, in the rhythm of footsteps following herds, in the songs sung beneath auroras. It would be the comfort of stories retold, the pride of surviving another winter, the gratitude for the brief thaw of spring. To live in such a world would be to know that every small act, every fire built, every meal shared, every path remembered, was part of a legacy of endurance stretching back through countless generations. It is easy, from our perspective, to see this frozen legacy as lesser, because it lacks the scale we are used to. But scale is not the only measure of meaning. A cave painting lasting 10,000 years speaks as profoundly as any monument. A story carried unchanged across centuries is as powerful as any book. A small community surviving together in harmony with the land may carry more wisdom than the largest empire. The frozen legacy of humanity would not be loud, but it would be lasting, written not in stone, but in the resilience of people, in the quiet beauty of life lived close to the Earth. If Earth had never left the Ice Age, our legacy would not be skyscrapers or machines, but something gentler, subtler, more intimate. It would be firelight in the dark, footprints in the snow, voices lifted in story beneath frozen skies. It would be the enduring presence of life itself, fragile but unbroken, continuing through the longest winter. And perhaps, when all is said and done, that is the truest legacy humanity could ever leave. Not the things we build, but the fact that we endure, that we love, that we tell stories, that we carry warmth against the cold.